They had already started saying goodbye. The canyon was too tight, the enemy too entrenched, and the sky above them far too lethal for any aircraft to survive. Their last radio message was brief. "We'll hold as long as we can. If you're hearing this, tell our families we fought." In the command tent miles away, no one argued. Pilots refused the route. Drones couldn't even see inside. Not a single soul believed air support was possible except one. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for backup. And when her A-10 engine roared to life, even the ground crews stopped what they were doing to watch. Because everyone knew once she took the sky, something was about to change. Not just in that canyon, but in the history of what one pilot could do alone. Millerville, Pennsylvania wasn't the kind of town that made it onto postcards. It was a place of faded brick buildings, weathered American flags, and men who still removed their hats when a woman walked by. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone's business, but pretended they didn't. On the east end stood Miller's Station, a gas stop that had serviced cars since 1958, when Eisenhower was still in office and America was simpler, or at least seemed that way to those who preferred their memories selective. The station belonged to Frank Daniels, a Vietnam veteran who spoke little about the war but whose eyes carried its shadows. Every morning at 5 a.m., Frank would raise the flag outside the shop, his movements precise, ritualistic. Locals knew not to speak to him during this ceremony. They understood some traditions carried weight beyond explanation. It was here, among the smell of motor oil and the ping of service bells, that Jessica Daniels grew up. A quiet child with watchful eyes, more comfortable with machines than people. While other girls her age collected dolls or posters of boy bands, Jessica collected model airplanes, hanging them from her bedroom ceiling on fishing lines stolen from her father's tackle box. "That girl," the town mechanic once said, watching 12-year-old Jessica disassemble a carburetor, "doesn't talk to people. She talks to engines." There was truth in those words. Jessica didn't speak unless necessary, a trait inherited from her father. But when she did speak, it was with a certainty that made adults stop and listen. At school, teachers marked her as withdrawn on reports, suggesting counseling that Frank Daniels politely but firmly declined. "She ain't withdrawn," he told the principal. "She's listening." And listening she was, but not to people. Jessica listened to machines, the sputter of a failing fuel pump, the uneven rhythm of misaligned gears, the satisfied purr of an engine running at optimal performance. She could diagnose a car problem before the hood was fully raised, a gift that made her father's business the most trusted service station in 3 counties. The summer Jessica turned 16, a peculiar customer pulled into Miller Station. The man drove a restored 1967 Mustang that rumbled like distant thunder. He wore an Air Force baseball cap faded from years of sun. While Frank filled the tank, the man watched Jessica check the oil in a neighbor's pickup. "She's got the touch," the man said. Frank nodded. "Always has. Ever think about what she might do with it?" Frank shrugged. "Up to her." The man introduced himself as Colonel James Whitmore, retired. He left his card before driving away, the Mustang's engine singing a perfect mechanical harmony. That night, Jessica found the card on her dresser. She turned it over in her hands, feeling its weight. She knew her father well enough to understand. This wasn't suggestion. This was permission. 6 years later, Jessica Daniels walked through the gates of Laughlin Air Force Base in Texas, her belongings in one duffel bag, her words as sparse as ever. The instructors there encountered a peculiar candidate, technically brilliant but socially enigmatic, physically capable but seemingly detached. "Too quiet," Flight Chief Garrison wrote in his logbook after her first week. "Watch closely." They mistook her stillness for doubt, her silence for hesitation. But Jessica wasn't uncertain. She was absorbing everything, the wind patterns across the tarmac, the subtle differences in engine sounds, the way light played across the horizon at different altitudes. During her first solo flight, Jessica took the T-6 Texan II trainer to its limits, executing maneuvers with a precision that left her instructors reviewing the flight recorder data multiple times. "Did you see this?" Lieutenant Colonel Harris asked, pointing to the readout. "She adjusted for wind shear 3 seconds before the sensors picked it up. That's not training. That's instinct." Jessica's academic record was equally impressive. She memorized wind shear patterns and calculated crosswind limits in her head, working out complex aviation problems without touching pen to paper. She rarely spoke in class unless called upon, and never socialized at the officers' club. Some classmates called her Ghost behind her back, a nickname that would prove ironically prophetic years later. It was during her A-10 orientation flight that everything changed. The instructors had warned her class, "The Warthog is not graceful. It's a flying tank. Respect its bulk or it will put you into the ground." Jessica sat in the cockpit, running her hands across the controls. Something connected. While others fought the machine's raw power, Jessica moved with it, as if the aircraft were an extension of her body. During simulator training, she pushed the virtual A-10 beyond what many instructors believed possible, threading it through canyons and weather conditions that would ground most pilots. After her first real flight in the Warthog, a veteran instructor, Colonel Richard Hayes, a man who rarely offered praise, watched her perfect landing and muttered to his colleague, "She flies like the sky owes her something." No one fully understood what he meant, but the phrase stuck in the minds of those who heard it. Jessica graduated near the top of her class, despite what her superiors called her communication deficiencies. The Air Force, recognizing her exceptional flying abilities, reluctantly overlooked her interpersonal shortcomings. What they couldn't overlook, however, was the strange gap that appeared in her service record in 2018. 8 months, completely undocumented, a black hole in an otherwise meticulously detailed military file. When questioned, Jessica's response was as efficient as her flying. "Classified deployment, sir. Need to know basis." Her commanding officers checked with higher authorities, received cryptic confirmations, and the matter was officially dropped. But rumors spread, as they always do in military circles. Some said she'd been part of a covert operation in Yemen. Others claimed she'd been testing experimental aircraft in Nevada. A few whispered she'd suffered a psychological breakdown and been sequestered for evaluation. The truth remained elusive, hidden behind Jessica's steady gaze and the impenetrable wall of military security clearances. What was clear, however, was that she returned from those missing months changed. More focused, more determined, and if possible, even more reserved. At night, alone in her quarters, Jessica would sometimes wake from dreams of darkness and confined spaces, her heart racing, her body rigid. She kept a small metal object under her pillow, something that looked like a damaged dog tag, but wasn't. She never explained it to anyone, and no one dared to ask. Years later, long after the events that would make her famous, a declassified document would reveal that during those missing 8 months, a special operations team had been trapped in an underground bunker in an undisclosed location after a mission went catastrophically wrong. Their extraction had required a pilot willing to fly a modified aircraft into conditions that the mission planners themselves described as unsurvivable. The document never named the pilot, but those who knew Jessica's flying style would recognize the description. Asset displayed unprecedented spatial awareness and aircraft control, navigating without conventional instrumentation through conditions that rendered standard navigation impossible. It was the first time Jessica Daniels saved men who had been written off as already dead. It would not be the last. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was never meant to be beautiful. Born in the shadow of the Cold War, when American strategists envisioned Soviet tanks pouring through the Fulda Gap into Western Europe, the aircraft was designed with a single purpose: to destroy armored vehicles and provide close air support to ground troops. Beauty was irrelevant. Survival was everything. Engineers at Fairchild Republic started with the most devastating anti-tank weapon available, the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm rotary cannon capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at 3,900 rounds per minute, and designed an airplane around it. The result was an ungainly beast with a nose that resembled a boar's snout, giving rise to its nickname, the Warthog. Pilots who flew the A-10 developed a peculiar relationship with it. Unlike the sleek, supersonic fighters that dominated aviation magazines and recruiting posters, the Warthog was slow, deliberate, and utterly lethal. It could absorb punishment that would shred other aircraft, with redundant systems and a titanium bathtub protecting the pilot. It could return from missions with entire chunks of wing missing, engines sputtering, and still land safely. "You don't fly an A-10," went an old Air Force saying. "You wear it like armor and take it to war." Jessica Daniels understood this philosophy better than most. From her first encounter with the aircraft, She approached it not as a vehicle, but as a partner. During her training at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, she spent her free hours in the maintenance hangars, watching the mechanics work, learning the aircraft's internal systems with an intensity that made even veteran crew chiefs uncomfortable. Most pilots want to know what the plane can do, Chief Master Sergeant Wallace told his team after finding Jessica studying maintenance manuals at 2 a.m. This one wants to know what the plane thinks. And when Jessica was assigned her own A-10, tail number 80 to 0258, she spent 3 days inspecting every inch of it before her first flight. The ground crew watched with a mixture of amusement and respect as she crawled around the undercarriage, ran her fingers along the flaps, and pressed her ear against the engine housing to listen to the idle. "Getting to know each other?" a crew chief asked. Jessica nodded without looking up. "She's been through a lot," she said, tracing a repaired seam on the fuselage. "Desert Storm, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, 3 engine replacements, cannon refurbished twice, shot down once over Kandahar but managed to limp home." The chief raised his eyebrows. "You read her maintenance log?" "Every page." "Most pilots don't bother." Jessica finally looked up at him. "Most pilots aren't trusting their lives to machines they don't understand." She named the aircraft Shadow, though the designation never appeared in any official document. In the privacy of the cockpit, during pre-flight checks, she would run her hand across the instrument panel and whisper, "Let's go to work, Shadow." The habit would have earned her ridicule had anyone known about it. But like most things in Jessica's life, it remained private, personal. Their first flight together was textbook perfect, until it wasn't. Halfway through the training mission, at 12,000 feet over the Arizona desert, the right engine began fluctuating. Any other pilot might have immediately reported the issue and returned to base. Jessica instead eased back the throttle, listened to the engine's response, then methodically worked through a series of minute adjustments that stabilized the performance. When she landed, the maintenance team couldn't find anything wrong until Jessica directed them to a specific fuel line where they discovered a hairline crack that would have been catastrophic had it fully ruptured. "How did you know?" the maintenance officer demanded. Jessica shrugged. "Shadow told me." The nickname earned her a psychological evaluation, which she passed only because the examining officer was more concerned with her combat readiness than her personification of aircraft. The report noted, "Pilot displays unusual connection to assigned aircraft, but shows no signs of delusion or impaired judgment. Recommend continued observation, but no restriction of duties." What the report didn't capture was the truth Jessica herself barely understood. She didn't think the plane was alive in any mystical sense. She simply processed mechanical feedback at a level most people couldn't comprehend. Where others heard noise, she heard conversations between components. Where others felt vibrations, she read messages. As Jessica's reputation as a pilot grew, so did the mystery surrounding her relationship with the A-10. Some said she could fly it in weather conditions that grounded every other aircraft. Others claimed she'd once landed safely after losing both hydraulic systems, using only trim tabs and differential thrust, a feat considered theoretically possible but practically suicidal. The truth, as with most legends, lay somewhere between reality and exaggeration. What was undeniable was that Jessica Daniels flew the A-10 in ways that pushed the boundaries of its design specifications, often bringing the aging aircraft back from missions that should have been one-way trips. In 2010, an internal Pentagon memo circulated among senior Air Force officials proposing the retirement of the entire A-10 fleet, citing maintenance keys in the changing nature of modern warfare. The document included cost-benefit analyses, strategic reassessments, and political considerations. What it didn't include was any mention of a classified mission that had occurred 3 months earlier, in which an A-10 pilot had destroyed a high-value target deep in enemy territory after 3 previous attempts with more advanced aircraft had failed. The memo was shelved after several senior officers mounted an unexpected defense of the platform. No official reason was given for this change of heart. Years later, a Freedom of Information Act request would unearth a heavily redacted after-action report from that classified mission, with a handwritten note from a 4-star general in the margin. "As long as we have pilots who can make these machines dance, we keep them flying." The identity of that pilot remained classified, but among the small community of A-10 instructors, A rumor persisted that a young female officer had been awarded a silent commendation after the mission, a commendation that never appeared in any official record. This same officer would later become Jessica's most influential mentor, though their connection remained known to only a handful of people with the highest security clearances. Captain Eleanor Steele Garrison never acknowledged her role in saving the A-10 program, nor did she publicly take credit for recognizing Jessica's unique talents during a chance encounter at a training exercise. What is known is that in 2019, Captain Garrison specifically requested Jessica for a specialized training program, officially described as Advanced Close Air Support Tactics in Degraded Environmental Conditions. The 6-month program, conducted at various remote locations, pushed Jessica's already exceptional skills to new limits. When she emerged, her flying had evolved from impressive to seemingly impossible. It was Garrison who first suggested that Jessica's abilities might be most valuable, not in conventional squadrons, but in special operations support, flying missions that existed in the gray areas between official military actions, where pilots sometimes had to make life or death decisions without clear rules of engagement or reliable intelligence. Some pilots follow orders perfectly, Garrison told her during their final evaluation flight. Some pilots make good decisions in bad situations. But you, Daniels, you see things in the air that others don't. You hear what the aircraft is telling you. That's not something we can teach. Jessica kept her eyes on the horizon. Is that a compliment, ma'am? It's a warning, Garrison replied. The Air Force is going to put you in situations where no one should be able to succeed. And because you probably will succeed, they'll keep doing it. Is that why you requested me for this program? Garrison was silent for a long moment. I requested you because 8 years ago, I was in a situation where no one should have been able to succeed. Someone flew an A-10 into conditions that made my extraction theoretically impossible. I never saw their face, never knew their name, but I recognized the flying style when I saw your simulator runs. Jessica's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the controls. I don't know what happened during those 8 months missing from your record, Daniels, Garrison continued, but I know what it looks like when someone comes back from the kind of mission that changes who they are. I see it in your eyes. With respect, ma'am, you don't know me. No, Garrison agreed, but I know the A-10, and I know what it means when a pilot connects with it the way you do. These planes were built to take punishment, to fly broken, to come home when they shouldn't, just like certain pilots. The conversation ended there. 3 weeks later, Captain Garrison was reassigned to an undisclosed location. Jessica never saw her again. But the lessons remained, as did the unspoken bond between two pilots who had seen the darkest edges of what war could be. It was around this time that a maintenance technician discovered something unusual while performing routine service on Jessica's A-10. Hidden beneath the pilot's seat, secured with electrical tape, was a small metal box containing what appeared to be personal items. A tarnished dog tag that didn't belong to Jessica, a folded photograph of mountain terrain with coordinates written on the back, and a small brass key of unknown purpose. Following protocol, the technician reported the discovery to his superior, who in turn notified security. Within hours, 2 men in unmarked uniforms arrived, confiscated the items, and instructed everyone involved to forget what they'd seen. The incident was never recorded in any maintenance log. The next day, Jessica was called to a meeting with Colonel Martin Hayes, the base commander. No transcript of their conversation exists. The only evidence that the meeting occurred at all is a single line in the colonel's personal calendar. 0900, Daniels, Shadow Protocol. Whatever transpired in that meeting, Jessica emerged with her flight status intact and continued to fly her assigned A-10. But something had changed. The maintenance crew noticed that she now performed her own pre-flight inspections, refusing assistance from even the most experienced ground personnel. She installed a personal, non-standard lock on her cockpit, requiring a key that only she possessed. Most telling of all, she began flying with a sidearm, a non-regulation .45 caliber pistol in a shoulder holster, despite the fact that A-10 pilots in training exercises had no operational need for personal weapons. When questioned about these irregularities, Colonel Hayes would only say, Captain Daniels has special authorization for equipment modifications related to an ongoing security matter. No further questions will be entertained on this subject. What no one knew What would only become clear years later, when classified files were partially unsealed, was that during her missing 8 months, Jessica had been part of a mission that went catastrophically wrong. The exact details remain redacted, but what is known is that she was the sole survivor of an operation that cost the lives of 4 other Air Force personnel and an undisclosed number of Special Forces operators. The mission, codenamed Shadowcast, involved extracting a high-value intelligence asset from a hostile area. According to the declassified portions of the after-action report, Jessica's A-10 was shot down during the extraction. She survived the crash, evaded capture for 17 days in enemy territory, and eventually made it to the extraction point with both the intelligence asset and critical information salvaged from her downed aircraft. The brass key found beneath her seat was reportedly the only personal item she managed to keep during her ordeal, a key to her father's gas station back in Millerville, Pennsylvania. The full psychological impact of this experience on Jessica Daniels has never been officially assessed. What is clear is that after her return to regular duty, her already formidable flying skills had been honed by the kind of pressure that either breaks a pilot or transforms them into something extraordinary. As one flight instructor noted in an unofficial assessment, Daniels doesn't fly like someone who's afraid of dying. She flies like someone who's already faced it and decided it wasn't her time. The Italian Apennines in winter are beautiful but merciless. Clouds cling to jagged peaks, wind howls through narrow passes, and snow can reduce visibility from miles to meters in minutes. For military pilots training in these conditions, the mountains are both classroom and executioner, unforgiving of even minor mistakes. In January 2021, a joint NATO training exercise was underway in the region, with pilots from 6 countries practicing high-altitude maneuvers in challenging weather. The exercise, codenamed Alpine Shield, was designed to simulate combat conditions in mountainous terrain similar to Afghanistan's Hindu Kush. Jessica Daniels, by then a captain with a growing reputation for exceptional flying, was part of the American contingent, piloting her A-10 through carefully planned scenarios. The exercise had been underway for 4 days without incident when the weather pattern suddenly shifted. A cold front crashed into a heat wave rising from the Mediterranean, creating what meteorologists later described as a perfect storm, a rapidly developing pressure system that generated hurricane-force winds and near-zero visibility conditions. The exercise commander immediately ordered all aircraft to return to base. Most complied. 2 did not, a British typhoon and an Italian tornado, both caught in the most violent section of the storm front. Their last transmission reported disorientation and instrumentation failures. In the operations center, the senior officers began preparations for search and rescue operations once the storm abated, which weather models predicted would not be for at least 6 hours. No one believed the 2 jets could remain airborne that long with their reported fuel states. Jessica, monitoring the situation from her own A-10 as she returned to base, made a decision that violated direct orders and multiple safety protocols. Without requesting permission, she turned her aircraft back toward the storm, dropping to an altitude of just 500 feet above the terrain. "Warthog 2-5, return to base immediately," the controller ordered when her course change was detected. "Conditions beyond safety parameters." "Negative control," Jessica responded, her voice calm despite the turbulence already buffeting her aircraft. "I can get to them." "Captain Daniels, this is Colonel Westfield. You are ordered to return to base." "That's a direct order." Jessica's response was brief. "Sir, with respect, they'll be dead before the storm clears." She switched off her radio. What happened next would later be reconstructed from radar data, satellite imagery, and the testimonies of the British and Italian pilots. Jessica flew her A-10, an aircraft never designed for the kind of aerobatics she was attempting, directly into the heart of the storm. Using the mountain terrain itself as a navigation guide, she dropped below the worst of the turbulence, following valleys and ravines with nothing but visual reference points through breaks in the cloud cover. The British pilot, Wing Commander James Harrington, would later describe hearing a sound he initially mistook for thunder, the distinctive roar of the A-10's engines as Jessica's aircraft emerged from the clouds less than 50 meters from his struggling typhoon. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," Harrington testified, this massive silhouette appearing like a ghost through the storm. "She was flying that tank of an aircraft like it was a ballet dancer, using the air currents instead of fighting them. Using hand signals and wing tilts, Jessica indicated that the disoriented pilots should follow her. She then proceeded to lead them through the mountains using a route that no flight planner would have approved, skimming ridge lines, banking through narrow passes, at times flying so close to the terrain that snow was kicked up into her wake. 3 hours later, as the storm reached its peak intensity over the training base, radar operators detected 3 aircraft approaching from the north, far from the expected return route. The A-10 was in the lead, with the Typhoon and Tornado following in close formation. Jessica's radio crackled back to life. Storm caller reporting 2 in tow, you might want to shovel the runway. The landing was harrowing even by the standards of experienced military pilots. With crosswinds exceeding safety limits and visibility reduced to mere meters, Jessica brought her A-10 down first, demonstrating the approach for the others to follow. All 3 aircraft landed safely, though the Italian Tornado suffered minor damage to its landing gear. The debriefing that followed was equally stormy. Colonel Westfield, the American commander, was furious at Jessica's disregard for orders. The British and Italian commanders, however, were effusive in their praise of her actions that saved the lives of their pilots. Captain Daniels displayed either the most remarkable skill I've ever witnessed or the most foolhardy disregard for her own safety, Westfield noted in his official report. Possibly both. The name Storm Caller stuck, though it was soon modified to Storm Shadow, in recognition of how Jessica's dark A-10 had appeared and disappeared through the clouds during the rescue. The NATO pilot she had saved presented her with a hand-stitched patch bearing the new call sign, a storm cloud with lightning bolts reaching downward. What the official reports didn't capture was the transformation that occurred within Jessica during those hours in the storm. She had entered a state of heightened awareness where the aircraft truly became an extension of her body, where she could feel the air currents before they hit the wings, anticipate mountain wind patterns before her instruments detected them. It was a state she had glimpsed before, during particularly intense training missions or in brief moments of combat, but never sustained for hours as she had that day. The experience changed her understanding of what was possible in the air. It wasn't just flying, she later confided to her father during a rare phone call. It was like swimming through the sky, like I could feel every current, every shift in the air. Frank Daniels, a man of few words himself, understood the significance of his daughter sharing such thoughts. Your mother used to say you had angel's eyes, he replied, said you saw things others couldn't. Jessica fell silent for a long moment. I'm no angel, Dad. Angels ain't what people think, he answered. In the Bible, first thing they always say is fear not. Makes you wonder what they look like, that they had to say that they didn't. The conversation drifted to other topics, but the exchange stayed with Jessica. The comparison to angels seemed particularly ironic given her first true combat mission, which came just 3 months after the Alpine incident. By then, Jessica had been transferred to a forward operating base in Afghanistan, where her A-10 was needed for close air support missions. The Taliban insurgency had intensified in several provinces, and ground forces were increasingly calling for air support in mountainous regions where larger, faster aircraft struggled to provide effective assistance. Jessica's first official combat sortie targeted Taliban positions near a village in Kandahar province. The mission brief was straightforward: provide cover for a Marine unit extracting under fire after a raid on a suspected weapons cache. The reality proved far more complex. As Jessica approached the coordinates, she discovered the Marines pinned down in a narrow valley with enemy fighters controlling the high ground on 3 sides. Conventional attack runs would expose her aircraft to concentrated fire from multiple positions. What she did next became the subject of both official commendation and behind-the-scenes concern among her superiors. Rather than conducting standard strafing runs, Jessica flew her A-10 directly into the valley at an altitude of less than 200 feet, using the terrain to shield her approach until the last possible moment. She then executed a maneuver that veteran A-10 pilots later described as physically impossible, rolling the aircraft on its side to fly between 2 cliff faces barely wider than her wingspan, guns blazing at Taliban positions as she passed. The effect on the enemy was devastating. The unexpected attack from what appeared to be inside their own killing zone shattered their cohesion. The psychological impact of the massive A-10 appearing where no aircraft should have been able to fly sent many fleeing their positions, allowing the Marines to reach their extraction point. When Jessica landed back at base, her A-10 bore the scars of her unconventional approach. Multiple hydraulic systems were damaged, the fuselage was peppered with small arms fire, and one engine was operating at reduced efficiency due to shrapnel damage. Maintenance crews estimated that the aircraft had absorbed damage that would have downed most other platforms. "How did you keep it in the air?" the maintenance chief asked as he surveyed the damage. Jessica ran her hand along a punctured section of the wing. "I knew we hadn't finished yet," she replied. The official after-action report praised her innovative tactics and exceptional airmanship. The unofficial assessment, circulated among senior officers, raised concerns about her unnecessary risk-taking and deviation from established combat protocols. What no one questioned was the result. Every Marine in that valley had come home alive. In the months that followed, Jessica flew dozens of similar missions, earning a reputation among ground forces as the pilot to request when conventional air support couldn't get the job done. Her call sign, Storm Shadow, became a talisman of sorts. Troops in desperate situations would radio specifically for her, believing that her arrival meant survival was possible, even when the odds suggested otherwise. This growing legend made some in command uncomfortable. Pilots weren't supposed to be lone heroes or mythic figures. They were supposed to be interchangeable parts in a precisely calibrated military machine, following doctrine and orders with disciplined consistency. Jessica's methods were anything but consistent. She seemed to improvise tactics on the fly, adapting to conditions in ways that couldn't be taught or replicated. She brought her aircraft back damaged more often than any other pilot in the squadron, yet never lost one completely and never failed to complete a mission. "She's using that A-10 like a hammer when we designed it to be a scalpel," one Air Force strategist complained during a performance review. "With respect, sir," the squadron commander replied, "the Warthog was always a hammer. She's just found new things to hit with it." The tension between Jessica's effectiveness and her unorthodox methods came to a head after a particularly harrowing mission in early 2022. A special forces team had been compromised during an intelligence-gathering operation in a remote mountain region. Cut off from extraction and surrounded by superior enemy forces, they had gone radio silent after reporting that they were preparing for a last stand. Search and rescue operations were deemed too risky given the tactical situation. The terrain made helicopter insertion nearly impossible, and larger fixed-wing assets couldn't provide close enough support without endangering the team further. Jessica, returning from another mission when the call came in, volunteered to attempt a support run despite being low on fuel and ammunition. Her request was initially denied by the command center, citing the extreme risk and her aircraft's compromised state. What happened next remains disputed in official records. Some reports indicate that Jessica experienced communications difficulties that prevented her from receiving the stand-down order. Others suggest she deliberately disregarded the order, citing the emergency nature of the situation. What is confirmed is that she diverted to the Special Forces team's last known position, arriving just as they were about to be overrun. With less than 200 rounds remaining in her cannon and fuel reserves reaching critical levels, she executed a series of low-altitude attacks that scattered the enemy forces long enough for an emergency extraction helicopter to reach the team. The Special Forces operators were saved, but Jessica's actions resulted in her being temporarily grounded pending review. The official charge was insubordination and reckless endangerment of a strategic asset, the asset being her A-10 rather than herself. The review board, comprised of senior officers with no direct operational experience with Jessica, was inclined towards severe disciplinary action. Their decision was overruled by direct intervention from higher authority, specifically a general who had previously commanded special operations forces in the region. Captain Daniels displayed the kind of judgment and courage we should be promoting, not punishing, his memorandum stated. The men she saved were written off as already dead by our own command structure. Her willingness to attempt the impossible represents the highest traditions of the United States Air Force. Jessica was restored to flight status, but the incident left its mark. She became more guarded, more isolated from her fellow pilots. She requested and received permission to maintain and inspect her own aircraft, an almost unprecedented arrangement that further separated her from normal squadron operations. It was during this period that rumors began to circulate about her previous classified mission, the 8 months missing from her record. Some claimed she had been part of a covert operation that went catastrophically wrong. Others suggested she had been testing experimental aircraft systems that pushed the boundaries of human performance. The truth, like Jessica herself, remained elusive and largely silent. What was undeniable was her effectiveness. In an era of precision munitions and remote warfare, Jessica Daniels represented something older and more primal, the human element that could adapt when technology and doctrine failed. She was a reminder that sometimes, despite all the advances in military science, victory still came down to one person willing to fly into the storm when everyone else was headed away from it. As her reputation grew, so did the challenges assigned to her. Jessica was increasingly tasked with missions that planners classified as low probability of success, the kind of operations where conventional wisdom suggested failure was the most likely outcome. She succeeded anyway, time after time, bringing her increasingly battle-worn A-10 back to base with new scars and stories that she herself rarely told. It was others who spread her legend, the ground troops she had saved, the crews who repaired her aircraft, the controllers who monitored her impossible flights. In the spring of 2023, Jessica was transferred to a classified unit operating out of an undisclosed location in the Middle East. The unit's official designation was Special Aviation Detachment 5, but among those with the clearance to know of its existence, it was simply called the Ghosts. The Ghosts flew missions that didn't officially exist, in airspace where they shouldn't have been, against targets that weren't acknowledged. Their aircraft, a mix of A-10s, helicopters, and other platforms, were stripped of identifying markings and modified with non-standard equipment. It was here that Jessica finally found her place, among pilots who understood what it meant to operate beyond the edges of conventional warfare, who recognized her unique abilities without jealousy or suspicion. For the first time since joining the Air Force, she occasionally participated in the unit's rare social gatherings, though she remained the quietest member of an already reserved group. "You know why they really call you Storm Shadow?" Her new commander, Lieutenant Colonel William Drake, asked her during one such gathering. Jessica shook her head. "It's not just because you fly through storms," Drake explained. "It's because on the ground, when those boys are in the worst kind of hell, you appear like a shadow above them. And suddenly, the storm is happening to someone else." Jessica considered this. "I just fly the plane, sir." Drake smiled faintly. "No, Captain. You do a lot more than that. You give hope to people who've run out of it. And in this business, that's rarer than any medal they could pin on you." It was with the Ghost that Jessica would face her greatest challenge, a mission that would test not just her flying skills, but her very understanding of what it meant to be a pilot, a soldier, and ultimately a human being caught in the machinery of war. In June 2023, a SEAL team operating deep in hostile territory went silent after reporting they were surrounded and cut off from extraction. Their last transmission, brief and fatalistic, was sent from a narrow canyon in a mountain range whose name didn't appear on official maps. "We'll hold as long as we can. If you're hearing this, tell our families we fought." The canyon, known locally as Devil's Throat, was considered impenetrable by air. Previous attempts to fly support missions in the area had resulted in aircraft losses due to the unpredictable wind patterns and the enemy's entrenched anti-aircraft positions. The official response from command was grim but pragmatic. No rescue attempt would be authorized given the tactical situation. The SEALs were on their own. Jessica, monitoring communications from the Ghost Operations Center, recognized something in that final transmission. Not just resignation, but the same quiet determination she had carried her entire life. These men weren't giving up. They were fighting to the end, even knowing that end was coming. Without speaking to anyone, she walked out of the operations center and headed toward the hangars where her A-10, battle-scarred, patched but still lethal, waited in the desert sun. She didn't need permission. She didn't wait for backup. And when her engines roared to life, even the ground crews, accustomed to the Ghost's unorthodox operations, stopped to watch. Because everyone knew once Storm Shadow took the sky, something was about to change. Not just in that canyon, but in the history of what one pilot could do alone. The first sign that Jessica had truly left safety behind wasn't the turbulence or the drop in altitude. It was the silence. The moment Captain Jessica Daniels dipped her A-10 beneath the radar line, the comms began to crackle, then fade. The world outside shrank. There were no voices, No updates from command, no chatter from the tower, just the hum of the engines and the growing roar of wind as it funneled through the jagged walls of the canyon ahead. She had entered what pilots called the maw, a deep-cut trench of earth that twisted like a serpent and spat out most things that dared enter. The official designation was Cedar Ridge Sector Zulu, but to those who had tried flying it before and failed, it was simply the trap. Marcus Reynolds was not a man who frightened easily. 22 years in the Navy SEALs had taught him the difference between fear and caution, between calculated risks and suicide missions. At 42, his face weathered by sun and wind, eyes sharp beneath a permanent squint, he had survived 3 wars and countless classified operations that would never appear in any history book. He was the kind of soldier younger men tried to emulate and senior officers relied upon when official options had been exhausted. His team, officially designated SEAL Team 6, Bravo 6, operated in the shadows between policy and necessity. Now, crouched behind a boulder in a canyon the locals called Devil's Throat, Reynolds checked his ammunition and made the kind of calculation no training manual could teach. 6 men still combat effective, 2 wounded but mobile. Ammunition for perhaps 20 minutes of sustained firefight. No extraction plan, hostile forces controlling all high ground. "Cap," his radio operator whispered, "still nothing from Black Hawk Command." Reynolds nodded once. He hadn't expected a response. Their mission, officially a reconnaissance of suspected weapons caches in this remote region of Iraq, had gone sideways the moment they entered the canyon. What was supposed to be an abandoned training camp had turned out to be a fully operational base, with at least 60 hostile fighters and enough weaponry to equip a small army. Worse, they had walked straight into an ambush. Someone had known they were coming. Someone had prepared. "Erickson," Reynolds called softly to his second in command, "give me options." Lieutenant Jack Erickson, a 34-year-old former college football player with a master's degree in physics, moved to his position, staying low to avoid the sporadic gunfire still peppering their location. "Not loving our choices, Cap," Erickson replied. "Canyon narrows about half a click south. Might be able to create a bottleneck, make them pay for every foot." Reynolds studied the terrain. The canyon walls rose nearly vertical on both sides, reaching heights of 800 feet in some sections. The narrow floor was strewn with boulders and scrub brush, offering limited cover. Above them, the sky was a thin ribbon of blue framed by jagged rock. It was a killing box, and they were right in the center of it. "Thompson," he called to his communications specialist, "try Black Hawk one more time, then switch to emergency channel Delta." Thompson nodded, understanding the implication. Channel Delta was reserved for final communications, the kind that included last words and messages to families. As Thompson worked the radio, Reynolds moved to check on the wounded. Petty Officer Michael Chen had taken a round through the shoulder, while Seaman David Martinez was nursing a shrapnel wound to his leg. Both men were conscious, their faces tight with pain, but eyes clear. "How we looking, Doc?" Reynolds asked the team medic who was rebandaging Martinez's leg. Petty Officer First Class James Wilson, Doc, to the team, gave a grim smile. "They'll live long enough to get killed by something else, sir." Dark humor was the language of men who had accepted their situation. Reynolds appreciated the honesty. No false hope, no wasted energy on what-ifs. "Cap," Thompson called suddenly, "I've got something on Delta." Reynolds moved quickly back to the communications position. Thompson handed him the radio, eyes wide with surprise. "Bravo 6, this is Black Hawk Actual," a voice crackled through the static. "We are monitoring your situation. Hold position." Reynolds exchanged a look with Erickson. Monitoring was not the response they had expected. Monitoring meant they were on their own. "Black Hawk Actual, this is Bravo 6, Reynolds responded. "We are pinned, high ground occupied, ammunition low, requesting immediate extraction options." The pause that followed lasted too long. When the voice returned, it was measured, careful. "Bravo 6, no extraction assets available at this time. Nearest QRF is 3 hours out. Recommend you find defensive position and conserve ammunition." Reynolds closed his eyes briefly. 3 hours might as well be 3 days. They wouldn't last 30 minutes once the enemy coordinated a full assault. "Black Hawk, be advised. We have recovered intel of significant value," Sheriff Reynolds said, the lie coming easily. Sometimes the mission mattered more than the men to those in command. Sometimes you had to give them a reason to care. Material confirmation of objective starlight. Repeat. Material confirmation of starlight. Objective starlight was a code phrase for weapons of mass destruction, specifically tactical nuclear devices that intelligence had been tracking for years. The claim would get attention, force a reassessment of extraction priorities. The radio remained silent for so long that Reynolds thought they'd lost the connection. Then, "Stand by, Bravo 6. Reynolds handed the radio back to Thompson. "Keep that channel open," he ordered, then turned to the rest of his team. "We're moving to the Narrows. Set charges on our fallback positions. If we're going to make a stand, we'll make it hurt." As the team prepared to move, Reynolds took a moment to study the sky above them. The thin strip of blue seemed impossibly distant, a reminder of a world they might never see again. In 22 years of service, he had never sent a final message. He had never needed to. Something in him rebelled against the idea of starting now. "Thompson," he called, "when Black Hawk comes back, tell them we'll hold as long as we can. If they're hearing this, tell our families we fought." The words were simple, direct, like the man himself. Reynolds had never been one for elaborate sentiments, but as Thompson relayed the message, the captain felt a strange sense of finality. These might well be the last words anyone heard from Bravo 6. What Reynolds couldn't know as he led his men toward their final defensive position was that his message had reached beyond Black Hawk Command. In a secure operations center hundreds of miles away, a quiet woman in a flight suit had heard his words and recognized something in them that others missed. Not resignation, but determination. Not a goodbye, but a promise. Jessica Daniels was already moving toward her A-10 when Reynolds and his men began their fighting retreat into the narrowest section of Devil's Throat. The canyon had been aptly named by locals. As it tapered southward, the walls seemed to close like jaws, creating a natural choke point where even a few defenders could hold off superior numbers, at least for a while. Reynolds positioned his men carefully, using the largest boulders for cover, setting their remaining claymore mines to channel any assault into predetermined kill zones. "Conserve ammunition," he instructed. "Single shots, confirmed targets only. Make them count." His men nodded, their faces grim but resolved. They were among the most elite warriors in the world, trained to operate in impossible situations. But training could only extend the inevitable in a position like this. Without air support or extraction, they were simply postponing the end. The first probing attack came 20 minutes after they established their position. A small group of fighters advanced cautiously up the canyon floor, using whatever cover they could find. The SEALs held their fire until the enemy was well within effective range, then opened up with devastating accuracy. 4 attackers went down immediately. The rest retreated, dragging their wounded. "They're testing us," Erickson observed, "figuring out our fields of fire." Reynolds nodded. "Next time they'll come from multiple directions. Probably try to get men on the high ground to provide covering fire." The assessment proved accurate. The second attack, 15 minutes later, was more coordinated. Enemy fighters advanced along both walls of the canyon as well as the floor, moving from cover to cover, laying down suppressive fire as they came. The SEALs responded with disciplined bursts, dropping several attackers, but the pressure was mounting. A round ricocheted off the boulder near Reynolds, sending stone fragments into his cheek. He ignored the sting, focusing on picking off an enemy fighter who had established a position on a ledge above them. "Thompson," he called over the gunfire. "Any word from Black Hawk?" The communications specialist shook his head. "Nothing since we sent the final message, Cap." Reynolds had expected as much. Command had made their decision. Bravo 6 was on its own. The firefight intensified as more enemy fighters joined the assault. The SEALs continued to hold, but their situation was deteriorating rapidly. Martinez took another round, this one grazing his neck. Chen's bandages were soaked through with fresh blood as his wound reopened during the fighting. "Ammunition check," Reynolds ordered during a brief lull. The reports confirmed his fears. They were down to their last magazines. Another coordinated assault would likely overwhelm their position. It was then that Thompson's radio crackled unexpectedly to life. The voice that came through was not from Black Hawk Command, but from someone much closer, and moving closer still. "Bravo 6, this is Storm Shadow. Do you copy?" The team exchanged confused glances. The call sign was unfamiliar, not part of their operation. This is Bravo 6, Reynolds responded cautiously. Identify yourself. A-10 pilot inbound to your position. Need immediate situation report. For a moment, Reynolds thought he'd misheard. A-10 support hadn't been part of their mission parameters, and the canyon was considered no-fly territory due to the terrain and enemy anti-aircraft positions. Storm Shadow, be advised, we are pinned down at the southern narrows. Heavy enemy presence on both high grounds and canyon floor. No clear LZ available. Not looking for an LZ, Bravo 6, the voice replied, oddly calm given the circumstances. I'm coming in hot. Mark your position with smoke if you have it. Reynolds hesitated only briefly before making his decision. Erickson, purple smoke, northern perimeter. As his second-in-command prepared the smoke grenade, Reynolds returned to the radio. Storm Shadow, purple smoke incoming. Be advised, enemy has RPGs and possible man-pads on the high ground. Copy that, Bravo 6. Keep your heads down. Things are about to get loud. There was something in the pilot's voice, a quiet confidence that bordered on detachment, that made Reynolds believe, against all logic, that help was actually coming. In 22 years of combat operations, he had developed an instinct for distinguishing between genuine capability and hollow bravado. This pilot, whoever they were, wasn't making empty promises. Erickson tossed the smoke grenade, sending a plume of purple rising from their position. Almost immediately, enemy fire intensified, concentrating on the smoke's origin point. They see it, Doc Wilson called out unnecessarily, firing back at the new threats. They're not the only ones, Reynolds replied, his eyes fixed on the strip of sky above them. At first there was nothing, just the empty blue between the canyon walls. Then a shadow passed overhead, too fast to track. The sound followed a second later, a distinctive roar that every ground forces veteran recognized, the engines of an A-10 Warthog. The aircraft didn't immediately appear again. The SEALs held their positions, continuing to return fire against the increasingly determined enemy assault. Reynolds was beginning to wonder if he'd imagined the A-10 when the radio came alive once more. Bravo 6, I have visual on enemy positions. Multiple hostiles on both ridgelines. Technical vehicles approaching from the north. Stand by. Before Reynolds could acknowledge, the world exploded. The sound came first, a noise like nothing in nature, a mechanical roar that has seemed to tear the air itself apart. Veterans called it the BERT, the distinctive sound of the A-10's GAU-8 Avenger cannon firing 30mm rounds at 3,900 per minute. To those who had never heard it in combat, it was impossible to describe. To those who had, it was unforgettable. The northern ridgeline erupted in dust and debris as the cannon fire stitched across enemy positions. Concrete bunkers shattered. Cover positions disintegrated. Bodies vanished into red mist and flying rock. Then the A-10 itself appeared, streaking between the canyon walls at an altitude that seemed impossible, no more than 100 feet above the floor. It banked hard, nearly perpendicular to the ground, wings almost scraping the western wall as it came around for another pass. The SEALs watched in stunned silence as the aircraft executed maneuvers that defied both physics and common sense. The A-10 wasn't designed for this kind of flying. It was a close-air support platform meant to loiter above battlefields at sensible altitudes, not dance between canyon walls like a swallow. Jesus Christ, Erickson whispered, echoing the thoughts of every man in the team. The A-10 made another pass, this time targeting the eastern ridgeline. Again the cannon roared, and again enemy positions disappeared in explosions of dust and flame. Two technical vehicles attempting to approach from the north were caught in the open. One flipped completely over from the impact of multiple 30mm rounds. The other swerved into a boulder, rupturing into a fireball. As quickly as it had appeared, the A-10 vanished, pulling up and over the canyon rim. The sudden silence was almost as shocking as the attack had been. Enemy fire, which had been constant for hours, ceased entirely. Storm Shadow, this is Bravo 6, Reynolds radioed. Good effect on target. Be advised, we still have hostiles in the area. Copy that, Bravo 6, came the response. I'm making another sweep from the south. Stand by. Reynolds used the respite to reorganize his team. The wounded were moved to more protected positions. Ammunition was redistributed. For the first time in hours, there was a sense that survival might be possible. Thompson, try Blackhawk again, he ordered. Let them know we have air support and request immediate extraction. As Thompson worked the radio, Reynolds studied the canyon walls where the A-10 had made its attack runs. The precision had been incredible. Enemy positions destroyed while avoiding any fire near the SEAL team's location. Whoever was flying that aircraft had skills beyond normal combat training. "Cap, I've got Black Hawk," Thompson called. "They're spinning up a QRF now. ETA 1 hour. 1 hour. It still seemed like an eternity, but with air support, it was no longer a death sentence. The radio crackled again. "Bravo 6, Storm Shadow. I'm picking up movement to the south. Looks like they're regrouping for another push. I'll intercept, but be ready to move north as soon as the shooting stops. Extraction will come from that direction." "Copy, Storm Shadow. We're Oscar Mike as soon as you clear the path." Reynolds gathered his team. "Listen up. Our friend upstairs is going to hit them again. As soon as she does, we move north. Martinez, Chen, can you walk?" Both wounded men nodded. They wouldn't be fast, but they would move. "Doc, you stay with them. Erickson, you're on point. Thompson, bring up the rear and keep that radio working. We've got one chance at this. Let's not waste it." The team had just finished preparations when the A-10 reappeared, this time approaching from the south. The canyon at this point was even narrower, barely wider than the aircraft's wingspan. It should have been impossible to fly through such a space at combat speed, but the A-10 came through it like a bullet through a barrel, engines screaming, cannon blazing. The southern enemy force, caught in the middle of their advance, was devastated. Those not hit directly scattered in panic, abandoning weapons and equipment in their desperate retreat. "Move," Reynolds ordered as soon as the A-10 passed overhead. The team advanced northward, moving as quickly as the wounded members could manage. They had covered perhaps half a mile when Thompson called out a warning. "Movement ahead! Multiple hostiles!" Reynolds raised his rifle, identifying at least a dozen enemy fighters establishing blocking positions in the canyon ahead. They had been caught between the SEAL's advance and the A-10's previous attack run on the northern approach. Before the team could take cover, the radio crackled urgently. "Bravo 6, hit the deck now!" The SEALs dropped immediately, pressing themselves against the canyon floor. Seconds later, the A-10 screamed overhead, so low that Reynolds could feel the heat from its engines. The cannon fire was deafening, concentrated on the enemy blocking force. When Reynolds looked up, the path ahead was clear. Bodies and wreckage littered the canyon floor, but there was no movement, no return fire. "All clear," he called, helping his team back to their feet. "Keep moving." They continued northward, encountering no further resistance. The A-10 remained overhead, circling the canyon, a dark guardian against the blue sky. Its presence alone seemed to deter any remaining enemy fighters from showing themselves. After 20 minutes of steady progress, they reached a wider section of the canyon where the walls sloped more gradually. Thompson's radio came to life with new coordinates, the extraction point where the QRF would attempt a helicopter landing. "Storm Shadow, this is Bravo 6, Reynolds radioed. "We're approaching the extraction point. Any hostiles in the area?" "Negative, Bravo 6. I've cleared the immediate vicinity. Be advised, I'm detecting movement approximately 2 clicks east of your position. Possible reinforcements." "Copy that. Can you keep them occupied until our ride arrives?" "Affirmative. That's why I'm here." There was something in the pilot's tone, not arrogance, but a simple statement of purpose, that resonated with Reynolds. This wasn't just another mission for her. This was personal in some way he couldn't define. The team reached the extraction point and established a defensive perimeter. The wounded were placed in the center of the clearing, while the combat-effective members took positions covering all approaches. Above them, the A-10 continued to circle, occasionally breaking off to make attack runs on distant targets that the SEALs couldn't see, but their guardian angel apparently could. 30 minutes to extraction, Thompson reported after checking in with Black Hawk Command. Reynolds nodded, allowing himself the first moment of genuine hope since the ambush began. They might actually survive this. As he scanned the perimeter, Reynolds found himself wondering about the pilot above them. Storm Shadow. The call sign wasn't familiar, and the pilot hadn't been part of their mission briefing. Yet she had appeared exactly when needed, flying an aircraft that shouldn't have been able to navigate the canyon, executing maneuvers that defied conventional training. "Thompson," he called, "see if you can get a proper ID on our air support." The communications specialist nodded, adjusting his radio. Storm Shadow, this is Bravo 6 Communications. Request verification of unit and deployment authorization. The response came after a brief pause. Bravo 6, this information is classified. Focus on your extraction. I'll keep the skies clear. Reynolds smiled faintly at the non-answer. Whoever she was, Storm Shadow operated in the same shadows as his own team, the gray areas between official operations where deniability was as important as capability. Fair enough, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. As long as you keep flying, you can call yourself whatever you want. The minutes ticked by slowly. The team maintained their vigilance, but the expected enemy counterattack never materialized. Occasionally, they would hear the distant roar of the A-10's cannon, followed by the rumble of explosions beyond their line of sight. Storm Shadow was keeping her promise, preventing any approach to their position. 25 minutes into their wait, Thompson's radio crackled with new information. Bravo 6, this is Black Hawk Actual. QRF is 5 minutes out. 2 Chinooks inbound to your position, call signs Hammer 1 and Hammer 2. Copy, Black Hawk, we are ready for extraction. Reynolds relayed the information to his team, then switched to the aircraft frequency. Storm Shadow, be advised, extraction is 5 minutes out. 2 Chinooks inbound. I have them on radar, came the immediate response. I'll provide cover for the approach and departure. Stand by. True to her word, the A-10 appeared again, dropping lower over their position, then banking away to establish a patrol pattern around the extraction point. The message was clear to any observers. This area was under protection, and that protection had teeth. 4 minutes later, the distinctive thump, thump, thump of Chinook rotors echoed through the canyon. The massive transport helicopters appeared from the north, flying in tight formation, their rear ramps already lowering as they approached the landing zone. Move, 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 Reynolds ordered as soon as the first Chinook touched down. His team responded with the efficiency of men who had trained for exactly this scenario. The wounded were loaded first, followed by the remaining team members. Reynolds himself was the last aboard, maintaining security until everyone else was safely on the aircraft. As he turned to climb the ramp, movement caught his eye on a ridge to the east. A flash of light, sunlight reflecting off metal, followed by the distinctive trail of an RPG launch. The rocket streaked toward the second Chinook, which was still hovering just above the ground as it took on the last of the team. RP, Reynolds shouted, but his warning was lost in the roar of the helicopters. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The A-10, which had been circling overhead, suddenly dove toward the ground. It passed directly between the RPG and its target, its massive fuselage intercepting the rocket's path. The explosion was silent from Reynolds' perspective, obscured by the noise of the Chinooks. But he saw the flash in the cloud of smoke that enveloped the A-10's right wing. For a heart-stopping moment, he thought the aircraft would crash. It wobbled visibly, losing altitude, the right engine trailing smoke. Then, incredibly, it stabilized, banking away from the extraction zone and climbing back to a protective altitude. She just intercepted an RPG with her plane, someone said over the team's comm channel, voice thick with disbelief. Reynolds couldn't tear his eyes away from the damaged A-10 as it continued to fly, wounded but unbowed, maintaining its protective circle around the extraction. The pilot had deliberately placed her aircraft in the path of a rocket to protect men she didn't even know. As the Chinooks lifted off, carrying Bravo 6 to safety, Reynolds switched to the aircraft frequency one last time. Storm Shadow, this is Bravo 6 Actual. Your aircraft is damaged. Return to base immediately. The response came through clearly, despite the background noise of straining engines. Negative, Bravo 6. I'll escort you out of the hot zone. Your right engine is smoking. You need to... I'll escort you out, she repeated, the tone brooking no argument. That's why I'm here. Reynolds understood then what he was witnessing. This wasn't just exceptional flying or uncommon courage. This was something deeper, a commitment to mission that transcended self-preservation. He had seen it before in the most elite operators, men who would die before abandoning their post or their team. Copy that, Storm Shadow, he said finally. Lead the way. From the Chinook's open door, Reynolds watched as the damaged A-10 continued to fly escort, positioning itself between the helicopters and any potential threats. Even with one engine compromised and visible damage to its wing, the aircraft maintained formation, a dark guardian against the bright sky. Only when they had cleared the mountains and reached safer airspace did the A-10 finally break away, banking toward what Reynolds assumed was its home base. As it turned, sunlight glinted off its scarred fuselage, creating a momentary flash like a farewell salute. "Godspeed, Storm Shadow," Reynolds said quietly. "Whoever you are." Major Elaine Storm Shadow Daniels stood quietly near the back of the operations tent, arms crossed, her flight suit dusted from the hangar. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at the green glow of the monitor as if willing it to come back to life. But the screen remained blank. No signal, no blip, just silence. Captain Mason, one of the SEAL team's liaisons, leaned forward across the ops table. "That canyon's a death trap. Even a drone won't make it in." Around him, officers and analysts traded helpless glances. The maps were already marked with ominous notations. Terrain elevation, brutal. Crosswinds, unpredictable. Radar, blind in most sectors. The valley was a snaking trench of rock and shadow buried deep inside the Cedar Ridge Mountains, nicknamed by locals as the Devil's Throat. It was a fitting name for a place about to become a tomb for Bravo 6. Lieutenant Colonel Harris stepped forward, his face set in the grim expression of a man who had made similar decisions before. "We wait until nightfall. If they're still breathing, we go in with Black Hawks under low moon." Everyone in the room knew that would be too late. The enemy controlled the peaks, armed with ARPs, heat-seeking launchers, and eyes trained on every path in and out. Bravo 6 had stumbled into a perfect ambush, and now, surrounded on all sides, their fate was just a matter of time. Someone whispered it aloud. "Even the SEALs are saying goodbye." That was when Jessica stepped forward. "No," she said loud enough to silence the tent. "We're not waiting." Harris turned. "Excuse me?" She didn't flinch. "I've flown that canyon before during Operation Gatefire. I know where the thermals break. I know how to ride the wind between those rock faces." "Major Daniels," Harris said slowly, "you're proposing low-altitude CAS in a dead zone." "Yes, sir." "You'd be flying blind." "Not blind," she said, "just below everyone else." There were a few scoffs in the room. One of the drone techs muttered, "She's not serious." Another whispered, "That place chews up aircraft." But Jessica didn't respond. Her eyes never left the map. "If I go in under the ridgeline and hug the southern wall, I can follow the shadows. Use the turbulence to my advantage. Stay fast, stay low. Don't give them time to blink." Harris shook his head. "You'd have to fly under 200 feet just to enter. That's below safety threshold. If you clip a wing, I won't. We lose the aircraft." "Understood." "We lose you." "I know the risk." He stared at her for a long moment. "Why now?" She pointed to the canyon. "Because they're not gone yet, and if someone doesn't give them cover, that last stand becomes a massacre." A silence fell over the room. Tactical screens flickered. Someone coughed. A pen dropped. Then softly, Captain Mason said, "You really think you can pull this off?" Jessica turned to him. "I don't think, Captain. I know." There was something in her voice, not bravado, but certainty, that made even the skeptics pause. This wasn't a pilot seeking glory or driven by impulsive heroism. This was a professional making a calculated assessment of risk and capability. Harris studied her face, searching for any sign of doubt. Finding none, he turned to his aide. "Get her aircraft prepped. Full weapons load. Priority clearance." The aide hesitated. "Sir, I should note for the record that this exceeds authorized risk parameters for—" "Noted," Harris cut him off. "Now get it done." As the tent erupted into activity, Jessica remained still, her eyes fixed on the tactical display showing Bravo 6's last known position. A small red dot pulsing faintly, surrounded by terrain that had claimed other lives, other aircraft. Mason approached her, voice low enough that only she could hear. "That canyon has taken down 3 helicopters and an F-16 in the past 5 years. What makes you think an A-10 will fare better?" Jessica's gaze didn't waver from the screen. "Because I'm not flying against the canyon, Captain. I'm flying with it." "That doesn't answer my question." Now she looked at him, her eyes carrying a certainty that made him step back slightly. "The others tried to impose their will on the terrain. They fought the wind patterns, the thermals, the radar shadows. They treated the canyon as an obstacle." "And you don't?" "No, I treat it as a partner." She turned back to the display. There are paths through that canyon that don't appear on any map, currents of air that flow like rivers. Find those currents, ride them rather than fight them, and the impossible becomes possible. Mason studied her with new interest. You've done this before. It wasn't a question, but Jessica answered anyway. Yes. Where? That's classified. He nodded, accepting the non-answer. In their world, some missions never happened. Some victories were never recorded. But the skills, the experiences, those remained, carried in the minds and muscles of the operators who survived. Those men down there, Mason said, they're some of the best I've ever worked with. Reynolds especially. 22 years of service, 4 Bronze Stars, never left a man behind. Jessica met his gaze. And I won't leave him behind either. 20 minutes later, Hangar Bay 3 roared to life. Her aircraft, an A-10C Thunderbolt II, was already prepped. Ground crew scrambled to load armor-piercing rounds, reset hydraulic systems, and double-check flare systems. The Warthog, affectionately nicknamed Shadow by its crew, was built for survival, for flying slow, hitting hard, and coming home ugly. But today, Jessica wasn't just flying ugly. She was flying impossible. A young crew chief jogged to her side as she zipped her gloves. Ma'am, wait. She turned. He held out a patch, handmade. Black thread on gray canvas. The shape of a storm cloud with lightning bolts slicing downward. It read simply, Storm Shadow. She smiled faintly. Didn't think anyone remembered that. We remember everything, ma'am, especially Kunor Pass. She nodded once and slipped the patch into her sleeve. Then she climbed the ladder into her cockpit. Inside, everything was calm. The kind of calm that comes just before the sky tears itself open. Her hands moved automatically. Flaps, trims, throttle checks. The muscle memory took over, quieting the nerves. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the tarmac. Her HUD blinked green. All systems functional. The cockpit felt like a second skin. She exhaled once, then radioed. Talon Control, this is Storm Shadow requesting immediate wheels up on Vector 21. The response came without delay. Storm Shadow, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed. She pushed the throttles forward. The twin engines screamed to life. Tires screeched. The Warthog surged forward like it was chasing something ancient and primal. As she lifted off the runway, the entire airfield seemed to hold its breath. One tech whispered under his breath, "There she goes." "Where no one comes back from," another replied. But Jessica wasn't listening. She was already climbing, already scanning the range, already narrowing her mind into one single thought. 12 lives, one way in, no margin for error. She angled the nose of her bird toward the Cedar Ridge peaks. The storm was coming, and this time it had wings. The first sign that Jessica had truly left safety behind wasn't the turbulence or the drop in altitude. It was the silence. The moment Major Jessica Daniels dipped her A-10 beneath the radar line, the comms began to crackle, then fade. The world outside shrank. There were no voices, no updates from command, no chatter from the tower, just the hum of the engines and the growing roar of wind as it funneled through the jagged walls of the canyon ahead. She had entered what pilots called the maw, a deep-cut trench of earth that twisted like a serpent and spat out most things that dared enter. The official designation was Cedar Ridge Sector Zulu, but to those who had tried flying it before and failed, it was simply the trap. Jessica leveled the Warthog just above the ridgeline, her fingers feather-light on the throttle. The trees below looked like blades of grass. The valley's temperature spiked nearly 10 degrees. Thermal updrafts slammed into her fuselage like invisible fists. Her HUD flickered briefly. Altimeter reads 142 feet. Not low enough. She dropped another 15, riding the pressure zones like currents in a stormy sea. Every nerve in her body was tuned to the environment. Subtle shifts in sound, flickers of shadow along the rocks, sudden gusts that could flip her if she wasn't watching for them. She wasn't flying a route. She was threading a needle through a minefield made of air. Somewhere ahead, Bravo 6 was still alive, or what was left of them. Their last known coordinates sat along a southern bend in the valley near a shallow creek bed that had long since dried out into dust. She scanned the ridge lines above for movement, and sure enough, they were crawling with activity. Heat signatures, bodies in motion, enemy fighters positioning along the cliffs. She counted at least 12, possibly more. RPGs, at least 2 man-pads, and they hadn't seen her yet. That was her only advantage. She took a long breath, not out of fear, but to calm her heart rate. Low-altitude flying was already dangerous. Doing it while engaging in combat was a calculated death wish. But she'd trained for this. She'd rehearsed scenarios others refused to even simulate. She hadn't come to hover. She'd come to end it. With her left hand, she flipped the cannon safety to live. GAU-8 Avenger, 30mm, 3,900 rounds per minute. The weapon wasn't just powerful. It was surgical in the hands of someone who knew what they were doing. Jessica didn't pull the trigger yet. Timing was everything. She was close, but not close enough. The ridge needed to open. The targets needed to commit. She throttled down slightly, letting the Warthog drift into a steeper descent, 117 feet. Her proximity alarm blinked red, then cut out. She didn't need it. At this altitude, you didn't fly by sensors. You flew by feel. Suddenly, a voice broke through the static. Broken, distant. "Aller, do you copy? This is Echo." Jessica keyed the mic. "Storm Shadow to Echo. Say again. Confirm your position. South Gully, dug in. Incoming from both sides. RPGs above. Need cover now." That was all she needed. Jessica pushed the throttle forward and banked hard right through the canyon. Her left wing passed within 20 feet of the rock face. Her vision narrowed into a tunnel. Adrenaline kicked in. She let the Warthog fall another 10 feet. Altitude 102, speed 310 knots. The North Ridge came into view, and so did the muzzle flashes. Dozens, bright, hot, chaotic. The enemy fighters had no idea she was this low. No time to run, no time to blink. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 barked like thunder from hell. The sound echoed across the canyon like the voice of an angry god. Concrete bunkers shattered. Smoke erupted. Bodies vanished into debris. The lead RPG team was vaporized before the rocket even left the tube. A second group scattered, but they were too exposed. She walked the fire across the line, tearing through sandbags, makeshift shelters, and anything standing between Echo Team and a chance to live. "Splash, North Ridge," she radioed, eyes locked forward. A cheer broke through the comms. "We see you, holy hell, we see you." But she wasn't done. Movement to the west. 2 technicals in motion. Trucks with mounted guns bouncing across a ridge trail, clearly preparing to intercept anyone escaping south. Jessica adjusted flaps manually and dove again, taking a line just above the valley floor. The treetops brushed her belly. She angled toward the vehicles and fired another burst. The lead truck flipped, exploded. The second swerved into a boulder, rupturing into a fireball. Then silence. The valley was still. She could hear her own breath inside the cockpit, a strange stillness after the chaos. Her fingers hovered above the controls, still anticipating threat, but there was none. Not yet. Then a new voice came through the radio. "Storm Shadow, this is command. Radar shows hostile reinforcements approaching from East Ridge, 2 minutes out. Bravo 6 is on the move, heading south to the LZ. They need 5 minutes of air cover." "Can you hold?" Jessica looked at her fuel gauge. It was already below recommended combat threshold. Her flares 60% depleted. The left stabilizer had taken damage from the first pass. Her Warthog was rattling slightly, hydraulics compensating, but struggling. Still, she answered without pause. "Affirmative. I'll hold the line." Then without ceremony, she turned her aircraft eastward toward the new threat, toward the incoming swarm of fighters who thought the skies belonged to them. They were about to learn. When Storm Shadow was overhead, the sky belonged to her. The eastern ridge line emerged like a wall of broken teeth, jagged and chaotic, casting long shadows over the canyon floor as the sun dipped lower. Jessica knew the worst wasn't over. It was just changing shape. Reinforcements were coming fast, and with the element of surprise gone, the next few minutes would test every inch of her aircraft and every decision she had ever made as a pilot. She leveled out at just under 95 feet, the lowest she had flown in a live combat zone without night cover. The terrain ahead narrowed into a bottleneck. One way in, one way out. No forgiveness. Her proximity sensors had already failed once. Her HUD flickered intermittently, throwing off altimeter readings. She didn't trust any of it now. She flew by feel, by memory, by instinct. Her headset crackled. Storm Shadow, Echo Team reporting. Moving fast, but we're exposed on the south bank. Repeat, enemy moving in from above. She could almost see it without looking. Troops scrambling to reach the south ridge, looking to cut off the seals before extraction. The only way to stop them was to climb, but not up, down. Jessica dove. The Warthog's engine screamed in protest. G-force compressed her spine as the aircraft dropped like a missile. Trees rushed past like spears. Dust kicked up from the wake of her engines. Her undercarriage brushed the scrub line. Come on, hold together." Her own voice barely a whisper in her throat. She banked right, leveling just above the ground, and caught sight of the south ridge. Fighters were moving into firing position, RPGs shouldered, barrels raised. She flipped the manual targeting switch, locked eyes on the slope, and fired. The sound of the GAU-8 at this range was deafening. Not just noise, but impact. Each round a statement that this canyon, this battle, this moment still belonged to her. The ridge shattered. Dust columns rose like smoke from an altar. The enemy line broke, but so did her aircraft. Warning lights flared. Left hydraulic pressure dropped below threshold. Engine temperature spiked past red line. The Warthog rattled hard like a dying animal refusing to fall. Her hand stayed steady, her jaw clenched. She trimmed the control surfaces manually, compensating for the instability. One wrong twitch, and she'd become part of the valley wall. But she didn't let up. Another sharp turn, another fire burst, and the last RPG crew scattered into the rocks. "South Ridge is clear," she called out, her voice tight with effort. "Copy that, Storm Shadow. We're almost at the LZ." Jessica exhaled briefly. Then her radar, half functional at best, flashed a new warning. 3 heat signatures moving fast across the eastern slope. One was unmistakable. A man-pad unit, heat-seeking, shoulder-launched. The one weapon she couldn't outfly. Not at this altitude, not with her flare systems drained. She had no options, no time. Unless she made herself too close to lock onto. She slammed the throttle forward and nosed down once again, this time straight at the enemy. The world became a blur of gray and motion. Trees vanished beneath her. Cliff faces rushed past so close she could see the cracks in the stone. She weaved between them like threading a needle at 400 knots. The insurgents froze. By the time they realized what was coming, it was too late. Her cannon barked again, short savage bursts. The man-pad launcher flew backward in pieces. The others scattered, one tumbling down the slope in a roll of limbs and dust. She pulled up hard, too hard. The Warthog groaned, left stabilizer tearing at the seams. Sparks danced from her wing as it clipped a rock ledge. She felt the hit through her bones. The aircraft shuddered, lights flashed, fuel pressure dropped. She checked her gauges. Hydraulics failing. Left engine sputtering. Flaps offline. Still she flew. "Storm Shadow, this is command. Do you require assistance?" "Negative," and she replied, "Not done yet." Back in the canyon, Bravo 6 broke through the final bend toward the landing zone. A narrow patch of flattened stone marked by smoke grenades and dust. The Chinooks were inbound. ETA 3 minutes. The team needed exactly 180 seconds of clean airspace to reach it alive. Jessica looked at the sky and then she looked lower because there was only one way to guarantee they made it. She turned the Warthog back toward the eastern mouth of the canyon, set her course to fly even lower than before, and readied herself for one final pass. She was going to hold the line at the edge of the earth, below the cliff line, below radar, below reason. And if the sky couldn't protect them, then she'd take the ground instead. The dust never settled in that valley. It clung to everything: faces, rifles, boots, lungs, and as Bravo 6 ran for the landing zone, it choked their every breath. The canyon walls towered above like executioner's blades. There was no sky, only fire, and the constant thunder of small arms fire snapping from the rocks above. Corporal Reyes, second in the SEAL team column, glanced up between footfalls. At first, he thought it was just more smoke, more echoes. Then he saw it. A streak. Gray, fast, low, too low. He stopped running. "Is that?" Behind him, someone shouted, "Get down!" The air split open. The A-10 came roaring overhead at a height no jet had ever dared. Not in a canyon like this, not with live fire on both sides. The Warthog didn't buzz the ground. It scraped it, its engines howling like some prehistoric beast. To Reyes, it didn't even look like flying. It looked like a machine falling sideways on purpose. And then the cannon opened up. A burst of fury from the GAU-8 Avenger poured into the ridgelines. The roar was so loud it drowned the gunfire. Rocks exploded. Enemy positions disappeared in flashes of dirt and metal. What had been a clean ambush line became a graveyard. Reyes rolled behind a boulder and watched as the aircraft banked left so sharply that he saw the underside of the wings. One was scorched. The rear stabilizer was blackened. Flaps barely moved. She shouldn't still be flying. She shouldn't even be upright. But she was. Back in the command center, eyes were glued to the few operational sensors still tracking. The radar remained dark, but an infrared camera captured glimpses. Flashes of a nose cone. Trails of hot air slicing between cliffs. A cannon burst lighting up the rocks like a sun flare. A junior analyst whispered, "She's in the rocks, literally in them." The colonel leaned over the screen. God help her. Back in the canyon, Jessica could feel her aircraft giving out. The left engine was coughing smoke. The fuselage rattled with every maneuver. Warning lights had stopped blinking. Some had burned out, but she kept flying. The Chinooks had arrived, thundering low and heavy into the zone. Their massive blades kicked up cyclones of debris. The SEALs sprinted, weaving through rock and ruin, diving into the open bays as bullets chased their heels. Jessica circled overhead, daring anything left in those hills to take a shot. And they did. An RPG launched from the northern slope. A last desperate strike. She saw the smoke trail before the flash, veering up toward the second Chinook. She dove again. Her flares were gone. Her only chance was to fly between the missile and its target. She did. The Warthog screamed downward, passing inches above the treetops. The turbulence from her own jet wash sent the RPG spiraling off course. It detonated in the air. Harmless, angry, too slow. "Storm Shadow, you just intercepted an RPG with your plane," the pilot in the Chinook shouted. Jessica didn't answer. She was already banking again. From inside the Chinooks, the SEALs watched her pass. For a moment, even the noise faded. There was only awe and disbelief. What they saw wasn't just a pilot. They saw a phantom ripping across the battlefield, dragging steel and smoke behind her, dancing with gravity like it owed her a favor. Her plane was broken, her controls barely functional, but she wasn't slowing down. "Who the hell is that?" one of the rookies asked. The team leader didn't even blink. "That's Storm Shadow. You don't ask, you just thank her." On the ground, the enemy began to retreat or disappear. What few fighters remained either ran for cover or lay silent beneath the broken stone. The sky no longer belonged to them. The valley was hers now. Jessica pulled the stick gently, guiding the A-10 into one last wide circle above the extraction. Her body ached. Her eyes stung from the sweat and smoke. The engines coughed again. Her fuel light blinked red. "Bravo 6 to Storm Shadow. We are secure. Repeat, we are secure." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Copy that. Hold tight. I'll walk you out." Because extraction didn't mean freedom. Not yet. The enemy might have retreated, but the canyon still watched, and danger had a habit of waiting for the last second. As the Chinooks lifted from the rocks, Jessica pushed forward, flying escort at an altitude no doctrine would ever approve. She wasn't just clearing the sky, she was making a statement to the enemy, to her own command, to every pilot who had ever been told it couldn't be done. Below the cliff line, she had turned her aircraft into a storm. And the storm wasn't over yet. The Warthog touched down harder than any aircraft was ever meant to. Her tires screamed across the tarmac, one of them nearly giving out on impact. Sparks flew beneath the fuselage as Jessica fought to keep the bird straight. With no flaps, no brakes, and a failing stabilizer, it took everything she had to hold the line. The aircraft rolled to a stop near the end of the emergency strip. Steam rising from the engine bays, hydraulic fluid leaking across the concrete. For a moment, there was no movement, just the quiet hiss of cooling metal and a soft wind carrying dust across the runway. Then the canopy opened. Jessica climbed out slowly, helmet in hand, her flight suit torn and stained, one gloved hand gripping the side of the ladder like she might collapse at any second. But she didn't. She stood tall. Fire crews froze. Medics hovered. No one knew what to say. She had no visible wounds, but everyone could see it on her face. She'd flown to the edge of death and back. Her eyes were raw with exhaustion, her breath shallow. But beneath it all was something else. Calm. The kind of calm that only comes when you've done the impossible. Her aircraft was roped off immediately, engineers already scanning the damage. The left engine had thrown a blade. The cannon's barrel was scorched from overheating. The stabilizer was barely hanging on. One mechanic stepped back, removed his headset, and muttered, "She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't have made it." But she had. The debrief was short, tense. Command was already reviewing satellite footage, trying to piece together what she had done. The tactical report read like fiction. Radar dodging, cannon bursts from below 100 feet, last-minute intercepts. The Chinook pilots submitted their logs, praising her intervention. The SEALs submitted nothing. They didn't need to. Their survival was the only statement. Yet, not everyone was impressed. The Pentagon liaison joined via encrypted feed, face unreadable, voice cold. She ignored multiple standing orders, broke protocol, risked critical assets. Colonel Harris's jaw tensed, and saved 12 operators who would have died without her. "I'm not disputing the result. I'm addressing the method." Jessica said nothing. She didn't need to. The data was there. Altitude logs, speed readings, system overrides. She had dropped to under 70 feet in live combat, flown blind through a radar shadow, and taken out 3 separate threats with a crippled aircraft. There was no training manual for what she had done. No doctrine, just gut and precision. "She turned that aircraft into something it was never meant to be," the liaison said. "Maybe that's what we needed," Harris muttered. Outside the chain of command, the story was already escaping. A helmet cam clip from a SEAL showing her A-10 roaring past like a ghost went viral within hours. A frame from the footage, her jet slicing between the cliffs, cannon firing. Hit the internet with the caption, "This angel flies below radar." The public couldn't get enough. Forums lit up. News outlets ran features. Pilots whispered in mess halls and in flight schools across the country. Cadets began to refer to the impossible maneuver as the storm line. Jessica Daniels became a name they couldn't bury no matter how quietly they filed the reports. She was too fast, too loud, too effective. They grounded her temporarily. Pending review, pending evaluation, pending silence. But heroes don't stay grounded for long. 3 weeks later, her restriction was lifted unofficially. Her name was added to an internal roster marked Advanced Tactical Instructors. A new program was launching, one that needed a different kind of teacher. She accepted the assignment on one condition: no simulators, real terrain, real pressure, real flying. They gave her a field unit, a training wing, and eventually a new squadron of pilots, many of whom had grown up hearing about Storm Shadow before they even enlisted. She didn't teach them to break rules. She taught them to listen to the wind, to fly by feel, to know when altitude wasn't safety, it was distance, to trust that instinct wasn't recklessness, but refinement earned in fire. Years passed. The mission that made her legend became a case study. Quietly, without fanfare, the Air Force revised parts of its doctrine on low-altitude combat navigation. It was never officially called the Storm Shadow Method, but everyone knew what it meant. And somewhere in the Cedar Ridge Valley, there's still a scar across the cliff face. A place where one woman's aircraft passed so close it stripped bark from the trees and changed the direction of a war. The SEALs never forgot. Neither did the pilots nor the ground crews who watched her Warthog limp home, wings shaking but never broken. One day during a lecture at the academy, a young cadet asked her, "Major Daniels, what made you fly so low that day?" She looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "They told me it couldn't be done, but I knew better. Sometimes when no one else will dive into the fire, you have to become the storm." And she did. 6 months after the Cedar Ridge incident, Jessica found herself driving a rented Ford pickup down a lonely stretch of Pennsylvania highway. Spring had come early to the Appalachians, dotting the hillsides with pale green and the occasional splash of wildflowers. She drove with the windows down, letting the cool air wash over her face, carrying away the recycled atmosphere of military transport planes and briefing rooms. She hadn't been home in almost 2 years. The Air Force kept her busy, shuttling between classified locations, training pilots who were eager to learn what couldn't be taught in any manual. Her reputation had grown into something she barely recognized, part skill, part myth, wholly uncomfortable. The familiar sign appeared around a bend. Miller's Station, gas service, American-owned since 1958. The faded red and blue paint was peeling at the corners, and the prices on the manual sign were at least a decade out of date. But the American flag still flew from the pole out front, and a weather-beaten pickup truck sat in its usual spot beside the garage bay. Jessica pulled in, parking near the air pump. For a long moment, she just sat there, hands still on the wheel, studying the place where she'd grown up. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. Or maybe she was the one who had changed. The station door opened, and Frank Daniels stepped out, wiping his hands on a shop rag. He was thinner than she remembered, his hair more gray than brown now, but his posture remained military straight. He squinted against the sun, recognizing the rental truck, but not immediately seeing the driver. Jessica stepped out. "Hey, Dad." Frank froze for a split second, then nodded once. "Jess, didn't know you were coming. Wasn't sure I could make it until yesterday." He nodded again, understanding the unspoken realities of military service. "Coffee's fresh." It was as emotional a welcome as Frank Daniels was capable of expressing. Jessica followed him inside, ducking under the familiar bell that chimed whenever the door opened. The interior smelled of motor oil, coffee, and the faint hint of the cherry tobacco Frank occasionally allowed himself. They sat at the small table by the window where Frank took his breaks. He poured 2 cups of coffee from an ancient percolator that had been in the station longer than Jessica had been alive. "You look tired," he said after studying her over the rim of his cup. Jessica shrugged. "Been busy." "So I hear." She looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Frank reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. He smoothed it on the table and pushed it toward her. The headline read, "Air Force Pilot Performs Impossible Rescue in Classified Operation." There was no photo, but the article quoted unnamed military sources describing a female A-10 pilot who had redefined the limits of close air support in extreme terrain. "That you?" Frank asked, though it wasn't really a question. Jessica nodded once. "Can't talk about it." "Don't need to." He tapped the article. "Says enough. Says you saved some boys who were in a bad spot." "Just did my job." Frank almost smiled. "Your mother would say the same thing about you that she always did. That girl sees things others don't." Jessica stared into her coffee. Her mother had died when she was 12, but the memory remained sharp. Ann Daniels had been the opposite of her husband and daughter. Talkative, expressive, always in motion. But she'd understood Jessica in a way few others ever had. "Got something to show you," Frank said abruptly, standing. "Out back." Jessica followed her father through the rear door of the station and across the small yard to the storage shed. Frank pulled a set of keys from his pocket, unlocked the heavy padlock, and swung the door open. The shed had always been Frank's domain, a place for tools, spare parts, and the occasional project car. Jessica had rarely been allowed inside as a child. Now, as she stepped through the doorway, she understood why. The small building had been converted into what could only be described as an archive. Metal shelving lined 3 walls, stacked with boxes, binders, and what appeared to be military equipment. A large map covered the 4th wall, with pins and string connecting various locations. "Dad, what is all this?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He moved to a specific shelf and pulled down a dusty metal box with no markings. Setting it on a small workbench, he unlocked it with a key from the same ring that had opened the shed. "Remember you asked me once about my time in Nam? About what I really did there?" Jessica nodded. As a teenager, she'd gone through a phase of trying to understand her father's military service. He had deflected most questions with brief, uninformative answers. "Told you I was just a grease monkey, kept the birds flying." Frank opened the box. Wasn't the whole truth. Inside the box were documents, photographs, and a set of dog tags that didn't bear Frank Daniels' name. Jessica picked up one of the photos. It showed a younger version of her father standing next to a helicopter with no markings. 6 other men stood with him, their faces purposefully turned away from the camera. Special Operations Support, Frank said quietly. Didn't exist officially. We went where regular units couldn't, did things that never happened, according to the records. Jessica looked up at her father with new understanding. You were a ghost. Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. They still call it that? Different name now, same idea. He nodded, satisfied. Figured as much when I saw that article. The way they described what you did reminded me of things we used to do, flying where you're not supposed to be able to fly. Frank pulled a folder from the bog and opened it carefully. Inside was a hand-drawn map of a canyon system. Notes in the margins detailed wind patterns, thermal pockets, and optimal approach vectors. Cedar Ridge, he said. We called it Dragon's Spine back then. Lost 3 good men there in '71. Extraction gone bad. Jessica stared at the map, then at her father. You flew Cedar Ridge? Tried to, weather turned, had to pull back. His voice tightened almost imperceptibly. Ground team never made it out. The realization hit Jessica like a physical force. That's why you didn't want me to join up. Frank shrugged. Partly, mostly I didn't want you carrying the same weights I did, but some things run in the blood, I guess. He reached deeper into the box and removed a small metal object wrapped in oilcloth. Unwrapping it revealed a battered cigarette light armor with an insignia etched into the side, a stylized ghost with wings. Unit lighter, Frank explained. Only ones who had them were the pilots who flew the missions nobody talked about. Been holding on to this, thinking maybe I'd pass it to someone who'd understand what it meant. He held it out to Jessica. She took it, feeling the weight of both the metal and the history it represented. There's more, Frank said, gesturing to the shelves. Started collecting after I got out. Information about operations that never officially happened. Places that don't exist on maps. Started connecting dots nobody was supposed to connect. Jessica looked around the shed with new eyes. Because somebody needs to remember, Frank answered simply. The official records get sanitized, the real stories get buried, but the truth matters, especially when they try to hide it. He moved to the map on the wall, pointing to a specific pin. You know what's here? Underground facility, built during the Cold War. Off the books. Supposed to house tactical nukes if things went south with the Soviets. Dad, still active, he continued. Not for nukes anymore. For something else. Something they're testing that they don't want anyone to know about. Jessica set the lighter down carefully. I can't talk about this stuff. You know that. Don't need you to talk. Need you to listen. Frank pulled another folder from a different shelf. 2 years ago, 3 A-10s went down in training accidents. Official report says pilot error, mechanical failure, bad weather. He opened the folder, revealing photographs of crash sites and technical analyses. But the real pattern is this. All 3 were testing a new targeting system, experimental, designed to allow precision strikes in zero visibility conditions. Jessica kept her face carefully neutral. Dad, same system that was in your bird when you flew into that canyon, Frank finished. Isn't it? The question hung in the air between them. Jessica knew better than to confirm or deny anything related to classified systems, but her silence was answer enough for Frank. Systems flawed, he continued, creates a feedback loop in certain conditions. Overwhelming sensory input. Those pilots crashed because they couldn't process what they were seeing. But you could, couldn't you? Because you don't rely on the system, you fly by feel. Jessica finally spoke. How do you know all this? Frank almost smiled. I fix engines in a small-town gas station. Nobody notices me. Nobody thinks I'm listening. But you'd be surprised who stops here on their way to the testing grounds up north. Officials, contractors. They talk freely around the old man pumping their gas. He tapped the folder. They're going to keep putting that system in aircraft. Keep losing pilots unless someone who's flown with it, who understands its limitations, speaks up. That's not how it works, Dad. I can't just tell the truth. Frank's voice hardened slightly. That's exactly what they count on. Good soldiers following orders, keeping secrets, even when those secrets are getting people killed. Jessica felt a familiar tension rising in her chest. The same tension she felt in briefing rooms when commanders proposed tactics that looked good on paper but would fail catastrophically in execution. The tension between duty and truth. What exactly are you asking me to do? Frank closed the folder. Take this information back with you. Get it to someone who can use it. Someone who can stop them from installing that system in more aircraft. That's classified material. Possessing it is a federal offense. So is letting pilots die because someone wants to cover up a failed project. Frank held her gaze. You've already broken plenty of rules when it mattered, Jess. When lives were on the line. The accusation, because that's what it was, beneath the statement of fact, struck home. Jessica had indeed broken rules, ignored orders, when she believed it was necessary. When following protocol meant accepting deaths that didn't need to happen. She looked around the shed again, seeing it now as her father must. A repository of truths someone wanted buried. A testament to the fact that official history and actual events were often divergent paths. There's something else you should see, Frank said, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner. He used a different key this time, opening it to reveal shelves of audio tapes and what appeared to be logbooks. Records from Cedar Ridge, not just from Vietnam days, recent, including communications from the day you went in. Jessica froze. How did you get those? Same way I get everything. People talk, people trade. Information has its own currency. He pulled out a tape. This one's interesting, recorded from the command center during your mission. Includes a conversation between your Colonel Harris and someone from the Pentagon about the real reason that SEAL team was in the canyon. Dad, stop. This is going too far. They weren't there for reconnaissance, Jess. They were there to destroy evidence. Evidence of American involvement in weapons transfers that were never supposed to happen. Weapons that ended up in the wrong hands. Jessica shook her head. You don't know that. Listen to the tape, then tell me I'm wrong. Frank held it out to her. She didn't take it. Even if you're right, what am I supposed to do with this information? Go public? Throw away my career? End up in prison? Get it to someone who can use it responsibly. Someone who can make sure the truth doesn't stay buried. Frank's expression softened slightly. I'm not asking you to be a whistleblower, Jess. I'm asking you to make sure the right people know what really happened. So those SEALs you saved don't end up being sent on another suicide mission to clean up someone else's mess. Jessica stared at the tape, then at her father. The pieces were coming together in her mind. Why Frank had always been so adamant about her not joining the military, yet so unsurprised when she excelled at it. Why he had seemed to know more about her missions than he should have. The old gas station wasn't just a business, it was a listening post. A gathering place for information that slipped through the cracks of official channels. You've been doing this your whole life, haven't you? She asked quietly. Collecting secrets. Building this archive. Frank nodded once. Someone has to remember the real history, the one they don't put in the books. And you want me to be part of it now? I want you to do what you've always done, Jess. See what others don't, and act on it when it matters. Jessica took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision before her. Her entire career had been built on following orders, even as she occasionally bent them to fit the realities of combat. What her father was suggesting went beyond bending. It was a fundamental choice about loyalty, to the institution she served or to a higher principle of truth. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Frank nodded, seeming to have expected that response. He carefully returned the tape to the cabinet and locked it. Take all the time you need. This isn't going anywhere. As they walked back to the station in silence, Jessica noticed how the afternoon light cast long shadows across the property. The flag still fluttered above the old gas pumps. Everything looked normal, ordinary. Yet beneath that mundane exterior lay something extraordinary. A repository of truths someone had decided the world shouldn't know. Just like beneath her own outward appearance as a disciplined military pilot lay the instincts and abilities that defied conventional limitations. Perhaps she and her father were more alike than she had ever realized. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch of the small house behind the station, Frank finally asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. That canyon run you made, was it worth it? Jessica thought about the men she'd saved, about Captain Reynolds and his team, who had been prepared to die abandoned in that rocky grave. about the moment she'd felt her wing clip the cliff face and somehow kept flying anyway. Yes, she said simply. It was worth it. Frank nodded, satisfied. That's all that matters in the end. Not the medals they give you or don't give you, not the records they keep or the ones they erase. Just knowing you did what needed doing when it counted most. As darkness fell over the Pennsylvania hills, Jessica found herself thinking about the other side of heroism, the questions that remained after the moment of courage had passed, the systems that placed men like Reynolds and his team in that canyon to begin with. The decisions made far from the battlefield that created the conditions for sacrifice. Her father had spent decades collecting those questions, assembling them piece by piece into a mosaic of hidden truth. Now he was offering her a chance to see the larger picture, to understand not just how she flew, but why she needed to fly into places angels feared to tread. The choice before her was clear, even if the path forward was not. She could return to her unit, continue training pilots to push the boundaries of what was possible, and leave the deeper questions unasked. Or she could accept her father's inheritance, not just the skill to fly where others couldn't, but the courage to seek truth others wouldn't. As the stars emerged above Miller Station, Jessica made her decision. Storm Shadow had one more mission to fly, not through the tight confines of a canyon, but through the equally dangerous terrain of buried truths and institutional secrets. This time, she wouldn't be flying alone. 1 year later, Jessica stood before a class of pilots at the Advanced Tactical Training Center in Nevada. The facility, nestled among the rugged mountains of the high desert, was where the Air Force sent its most promising pilots to learn the skills that couldn't be taught in standard programs. The 20 men and women seated before her represented the future of combat aviation, young, talented, and hungry to prove themselves. They had all heard the stories about Major Jessica Storm Shadow Daniels. Some believed them. Others thought they were exaggerated. All were eager to learn from her. Conventional wisdom says an A-10 can't fly below 500 feet in canyon terrain, Jessica began, pacing slowly across the front of the classroom. Conventional wisdom says you need a minimum of 2 miles visibility for effective close air support. Conventional wisdom says there are places aircraft simply cannot go. She stopped and faced them directly. Conventional wisdom is often wrong. A young lieutenant in the front row raised his hand. Ma'am, is it true you flew under 100 feet in the Cedar Ridge operation? Jessica studied him for a moment. What's your name, Lieutenant? Wilson, ma'am. Robert Wilson. Lieutenant Wilson, what's the lowest you've ever flown in a simulator? He straightened slightly. 250 feet, ma'am, in the A-10 training module. And how did that feel? Uncomfortable, he admitted, like I didn't have enough time to react if something went wrong. Jessica nodded. That discomfort is your brain telling you you're approaching a limit. But here's the question. Is it a real limit or just one you've been taught to accept? She moved to the tactical display at the front of the room and brought up a topographical map of a canyon system. Not Cedar Ridge, that mission remained classified, but similar terrain used for training purposes. The aircraft you fly have capabilities beyond what the manuals tell you, she continued. The question isn't whether an A-10 can fly at 70 feet through a canyon. The question is whether you, the pilot, have developed the skills and awareness to make it possible. For the next hour, Jessica walked them through the fundamentals of extreme low-altitude flight. Not the technical aspects which were covered in other classes, but the perceptual and cognitive elements that separated surviving from excelling. Your instruments are tools, not oracles, she explained. At very low altitudes in complex terrain, you need to develop what I call environmental reading, the ability to feel air currents before they hit your wings, to anticipate thermal pockets before your sensors detect them. Lieutenant Wilson raised his hand again. With respect, ma'am, that sounds more like intuition than technique. It's both, Lieutenant. Intuition developed through deliberate practice. The same way a musician develops perfect pitch or a surgeon develops steady hands. She fixed him with a steady gaze. Some of you already have the foundation for this. You feel things in the aircraft that you can't quite explain. You make adjustments before your instruments tell you to. You have conversations with your plane. Several pilots shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Jessica had touched on something they had experienced but rarely discussed, the almost mystical connection some pilots developed with their aircraft. Don't worry, she said with the hint of a smile. I'm not suggesting you talk to your planes. I'm suggesting you listen to them. They're telling you things all the time about the air, the environment, the physics at work around you. Most pilots only hear a fraction of it. As the class ended, Jessica assigned them their first practical exercise, a low-altitude navigation run through a designated training canyon, but with a twist. They would fly with their altimeters and ground proximity warnings disabled. You'll have a safety observer with override capabilities, she assured them as concerned murmurs spread through the room. But for this exercise, I want you flying by feel, not by numbers. Some of you won't make it through the canyon. That's fine. Learning your limits is as important as pushing them. As the pilots filed out, Lieutenant Wilson lingered behind. He waited until the others had left before approaching her. Ma'am, may I ask you something off the record? Jessica raised an eyebrow. There's no such thing as off the record in this facility, Lieutenant. Yes, ma'am, I understand. He hesitated, then pressed on. The Cedar Ridge mission. The stories say you flew an A-10 through spaces barely wider than your wingspan, that you intercepted an RPG with your aircraft to protect the extraction helicopters. Your question, Lieutenant? Were you afraid? The directness of it caught Jessica by surprise. Not a question about techniques or tactics, but about the human element beneath the legend. She considered her answer carefully. I wasn't afraid of dying, if that's what you're asking. I was afraid of failing, of not bringing those men home. Wilson nodded, seeming to process this. My father was a SEAL, ma'am. He served with Captain Reynolds. Now Jessica understood his interest. I see. He told me what you did that day, how you appeared when everyone else had written them off. Wilson's voice tightened slightly. He said he'd never seen anything like it, an A-10 flying where helicopters wouldn't go. Your father exaggerates, Jessica said gently. No, ma'am, he doesn't. Wilson looked directly at her. He said the official report doesn't tell half of what really happened, that there were things about that mission that got buried. Jessica kept her expression neutral, but her mind raced. This wasn't a casual inquiry from a curious student. This was something else, perhaps a probe, perhaps an opening. The official report is what we have, Lieutenant. Everything else is just stories. Wilson nodded slowly, seeming to understand the careful deflection. Yes, ma'am, just stories. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. My father also said that sometimes the stories are truer than the reports. That's why we keep telling them. After he left, Jessica remained in the empty classroom, thinking about his words. Stories versus reports. Truth versus record. The same tension her father had highlighted a year ago in that shed full of buried history. She had taken some of Frank's information back with her. Not all of it, but enough to begin her own investigation into what had really happened at Cedar Ridge. Enough to start asking questions through channels she trusted. It was slow work, dangerous in its own way, but necessary. The experimental targeting system Frank had identified had indeed been shelved after her discreet inquiries reached the right ears. 3 lives saved, potentially more. A small victory, but significant. The larger truths about why Bravo 6 had been in that canyon remained elusive. Captain Reynolds himself had been reassigned to a training position shortly after the incident, effectively removing him from operational deployments. Whether that was protection or punishment remained unclear. Jessica gathered her materials and left the classroom, heading toward the hangar where her A-10 waited for the afternoon's training flight. The aircraft, still bearing scars from Cedar Ridge despite multiple repairs, had become something of a legend itself among the maintenance crews. As she approached, she saw a familiar figure standing beside it, Captain Marcus Reynolds himself, now sporting the oak leaves of a major. He was studying the patched section of wing where she had clipped the canyon wall. Admiring the handiwork? She asked as she approached. Reynolds turned, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. Admiring the pilot who brought it home in this condition. They shook hands, the greeting of professionals who shared a bond beyond words. Jessica hadn't seen Reynolds since the debriefing after Cedar Ridge. Like her, he had been caught in the machinery of military bureaucracy, commended publicly while being quietly sidelined. What brings you to my corner of the desert, Major? Jessica asked. Official business. I'm evaluating the tactical training program for possible adoption by special operations units. Reynolds ran his hand along the repaired fuselage. Unofficial business. I wanted to thank you in person. Never got the chance before they shipped me off to instructor duty. No thanks necessary, I was just doing my job. Reynolds gave her a knowing look. We both know that's not true. You broke every rule in the book coming into that canyon. Risked your life and your career. Jessica shrugged. Seemed like a fair trade at the time. Fair to who? To the men who were down there fighting with no extraction plan. To the families waiting for them to come home. Reynolds nodded slowly. That's what I thought. He glanced around to ensure they were alone, then lowered his voice. Listen, I need to tell you something about that mission. Something that didn't make the official report. Jessica felt a familiar tension rising. Major, we weren't there for reconnaissance, Reynolds continued, confirming what Frank's documents had suggested. We were there to locate and neutralize evidence of an unauthorized weapons transfer. American hardware that ended up in the wrong hands through back channels no one wants to acknowledge. Jessica kept her face carefully neutral. Why are you telling me this? Because they're still doing it. Still running these black market operations. Still sending good men to clean up the messes when things go wrong. Reynolds' eyes hardened. And because someone's been asking questions, someone with access to information they shouldn't have. Someone like me, Jessica said quietly. Reynolds nodded once. They know you've been digging. They know about your father's collection. It's only a matter of time before they move to contain the situation. The warning was clear. Jessica's quiet investigation had not gone unnoticed by those with reasons to keep certain truths buried. What do you suggest? Be careful who you trust, and maybe consider that some secrets stay buried for a reason. Reynolds checked his watch. I have a meeting with your CO in 10 minutes. As far as anyone's concerned, I stopped by to personally thank the pilot who saved my team. Nothing more. As he turned to leave, Jessica called after him. Major Reynolds, one question. He paused. Was it worth it? The mission. Knowing what you know now. Reynolds considered this for a long moment. The mission was compromised from the start. Someone knew we were coming. Someone wanted us to fail. His jaw tightened. But watching you fly that day, seeing what one person can do when everyone else has given up, yeah, that was worth it. After he departed, Jessica completed her pre-flight check with mechanical precision, her mind processing this new information. The circle was closing. Her father's suspicions, Reynolds' confirmation, her own investigations, all pointing to a truth that powerful people wanted to remain hidden. As she climbed into the cockpit, preparing to take her students through their first canyon run, Jessica made a decision. She would continue teaching these young pilots to fly where others couldn't, to push the boundaries of what was possible. But she would also teach them, carefully, selectively, to question the missions they were given. To understand that courage wasn't just about facing physical danger, but about facing uncomfortable truths. The engine roared to life beneath her, the familiar vibration traveling up through her body. She felt the aircraft speaking to her in its own language of metal and motion. Ready, waiting. A weapon, yes, but also a tool, a means to save lives or take them, depending on who gave the orders and why. Tower, this is Storm Shadow requesting clearance for training flight November 7 with 4 students. Storm Shadow, you are cleared for takeoff on runway 3, winds 5 knots from the northwest. Jessica guided the A-10 onto the runway, feeling its eagerness to return to the ski. Behind her, 4 training aircraft lined up, piloted by students who had heard the legends and were about to learn the realities. Some would wash out, some would excel. A few might even develop the rare combination of skill and instinct that allowed a pilot to dance with the storm when others could only flee before it. And perhaps 1 or 2 would understand the deeper lesson, that the most challenging terrain wasn't found in mountain canyons, but in the landscape of truth and duty, where the maps were often deliberately incomplete and the dangers not always visible until you were already in their midst. As the wheels left the ground and the desert fell away beneath her, Jessica felt the familiar sense of freedom that came with flight. Up here, the complexities of ground-bound politics and secrets seemed distant, almost irrelevant. Up here, there was only the aircraft, the air, and the pure mathematics of flight. But she knew better than most that you couldn't stay above it all forever. Sooner or later, you had to come back to Earth to face the consequences of both action and inaction. For now, though, she had students to teach, skills to impart, and a legacy to build. Not just of exceptional flying, but of exceptional courage in all its forms. Storm shadowed a training flight. She radioed to the 4 aircraft following her. "Stay tight on my wing. We're heading into the canyon. Remember what I told you. Trust your instincts more than your instruments. Feel the air before it hits you. And never, ever believe something's impossible just because everyone says it is." The small formation banked toward the training canyon, the afternoon sun casting their shadows on the desert floor below. One large silhouette leading 4 smaller ones, like a storm front gathering strength. In the officers' club that evening, instructors gathered to compare notes on the day's training. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hayes, who had overseen the program for 3 years, shook his head in amazement as he reviewed the flight data from Jessica's canyon exercise. "I've never seen anything like it," he told his colleagues. "She took those students down to 200 feet on their first run. 3 of them made it all the way through. The 4th pulled up early. Good judgment on his part. Recognized his limits." "She's pushing them too hard, too fast," another instructor argued. "These aren't combat veterans. They're still learning the basics." Hayes disagreed. "She's not pushing them. She's showing them what's possible. There's a difference." The debate might have continued, but at that moment, the club's television, normally tuned to sports, switched to breaking news. A reporter stood outside the Pentagon, speaking urgently into the camera, confirming that classified documents relating to several covert operations have been leaked to major news outlets. The Pentagon has declined to comment on the authenticity of the materials, but sources within the intelligence community describe the breach as significant and potentially damaging to national security. The room fell silent as pilots and instructors watched the unfolding story. The reporter continued, detailing allegations of unauthorized weapons transfers, cover-up operations, and deliberate misinformation provided to Congress about military activities in several regions. "Among the most explosive claims," the reporter said, "are documents suggesting that American Special Forces teams were repeatedly sent into high-risk situations to eliminate evidence of illegal arms dealing facilitated by elements within the military-industrial complex. One such mission, which resulted in a near disaster and a subsequent heroic rescue, has become the centerpiece of these revelations." Jessica, who had entered the club just as the news broke, stood in the doorway watching the report with an outwardly calm expression that masked her inner turmoil. She hadn't leaked the documents, but she knew who had access to them, who had been collecting them for decades, who believed that some truths needed to see the light of day, regardless of the consequences. Her father had made his move in their long-running chess game with the powers that preferred darkness to light. Now the pieces were in motion, and there would be no stopping what came next. Lieutenant Wilson appeared at her side, his expression troubled. "Ma'am, isn't that—" "Not here, Lieutenant," she said quietly. "Not now." He nodded, understanding. Around them, other instructors and pilots were beginning to make the connection between the leaked mission details and Jessica's famous canyon flight. Whispers spread through the room like ripples in still water. Jessica's phone vibrated in her pocket. A text message from an unknown number. "Storm front approaching. Take cover." The warning was clear enough. She needed to move quickly to get ahead of whatever response was already being formulated in Washington. Her father had played his hand. Now she needed to play hers. "Ma'am?" Wilson's voice broke through her thoughts. "Are you all right?" Jessica looked at him. The son of a SEAL, a young pilot with exceptional potential, someone who might understand the difference between loyalty to an institution and loyalty to the truth it was supposed to uphold. "Lieutenant Wilson, I need a favor," she said quietly. "One that might complicate your career if anyone finds out." To his credit, he didn't hesitate. "Name it." "In my quarters, there's a sealed envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk. I need you to retrieve it and mail it to the address written on the inside flap. Today. Now." Wilson studied her face for a moment, then nodded once. "Consider it done, ma'am." As he left, Jessica turned her attention back to the television. The reporter was now standing in front of a familiar gas station in Pennsylvania. Miller's Station. The camera zoomed in on the building, where FBI agents could be seen carrying boxes of materials to waiting vehicles. The storm had broken, not just for her father, but for everyone connected to the truths he had spent decades assembling. including her. Jessica slipped out of the officers' club unnoticed as her colleagues remained fixated on the unfolding news story. She walked across the base to the hangar where her A-10 waited, its scarred fuselage gleaming dully under the security lights. She had choices to make now, difficult ones, with no clear flight path and no backup. But that was nothing new. She had flown into impossible situations before and found a way through. She would do so again. As she approached the aircraft, she noticed someone waiting in the shadows beside it. The figure stepped forward, revealing Major Reynolds. "I thought I might find you here," he said. "Come to arrest me?" Jessica asked calmly. Reynolds shook his head. "No, came to warn you. They're assembling a security team to bring you in for questioning. They think you're the source of the leak." "I'm not. I know that, but they need someone to blame, and you've been asking too many questions." He glanced at the A-10. "They'll be here within the hour, so whatever you're planning to do it fast." Jessica studied him carefully. "Why are you helping me?" "Because you flew into that canyon when no one else would. Because you saved my men when everyone else had written them off." Reynolds met her gaze steadily. "And because I've seen enough good people sacrifice to protect bad secrets." He handed her a small data drive. "Everything I have on the Cedar Ridge operation, the real briefing, the real objectives, the names of those who authorized it. Use it however you see fit." Jessica took the drive, understanding the risk he was taking. "They'll know it came from you." "Let them prove it." Reynolds checked his watch. "You have about 40 minutes before they lock down the base. Enough time to file a flight plan for a routine night training exercise." The implication was clear. Jessica could take the A-10 and disappear, at least temporarily. Buy herself time to determine her next move. "What about you?" she asked. "I'll be fine. I'm just a concerned superior officer who noticed you seemed stressed and came to check on you. Found you gone. No idea where you went." Jessica nodded, grateful for the cover story, thin as it was. "Thank you, Marcus. Thank me by staying alive." He turned to leave, then stopped. "One more thing. Whatever's in that envelope you sent with Wilson, I hope it was worth it. It's the complete technical analysis of the targeting system that killed those 3 test pilots. The evidence that the program managers knew about the flaws and covered them up." Jessica's voice hardened slightly. "So yes, it was worth it." Reynolds nodded, satisfied. "Fly safe, Storm Shadow." After he was gone, Jessica completed a rapid pre-flight check of the A-10. The aircraft was fully fueled, its systems operational despite the cosmetic damage that remained from Cedar Ridge. It would take her wherever she needed to go. As she strapped into the cockpit, she thought about the path that had led her here. From a quiet girl listening to engines at her father's gas station, to a pilot who had redefined what was possible in combat aviation. From a dutiful officer following orders to a woman questioning the system that issued them. The engines roared to life, their familiar vibration telling her everything she needed to know about their readiness. The A-10 wanted to fly. It always did. "Tower, this is Major Daniels requesting clearance for night training exercise Route Delta." "Major Daniels, you are cleared for takeoff on runway 3. Winds calm. Be advised, command is requesting you report to base operations before departure." So it had already begun. They were trying to ground her before she could leave. "Tower, I'm already on the runway with engines hot. Will report immediately upon return." Without waiting for a response, Jessica pushed the throttles forward. The A-10 surged down the runway, gathering speed, eager for the sky. Behind her, lights were already moving across the base, security vehicles responding to the unauthorized departure. Too late. The wheels left the ground, and the A-10 climbed into the night sky, disappearing into the darkness above the desert. Jessica banked eastward, setting course for the mountains where radar coverage was spotty and a skilled pilot could fly undetected. She had no definite destination in mind yet, only the certainty that she needed time and space to determine her next move. As the base fell away behind her, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She had crossed a line. There would be no going back to the life she had known. But perhaps that was as it should be. Some storms changed the landscape permanently, carving new paths where none had existed before. The radio crackled with urgent demands for her to return to base. Jessica switched it off. For now, there was only the aircraft, the night sky, and the freedom of flight. Everything else, the leaked documents, her father's arrest, the truths being dragged into the light, would still be waiting when she landed, wherever and whenever that might be. The A-10 continued eastward, a solitary shadow against the stars, carrying its pilot toward an uncertain future but guided by an unwavering principle that sometimes, when no one else will dive into the fire, you have to become the storm. And Jessica Daniels had always been good at storms.